He walked into that conference room like he owned the building, because technically he did. Damien Ashcroft dropped a thick manila envelope onto the polished mahogany table without so much as glancing at the woman sitting across from him. His attorney whispered something in his ear, and he actually smirked. Beside him, a woman in a cream silk blouse touched his arm with the easy confidence of someone who believed the hard part was already over. It wasn't. If you've never watched a man's entire world collapse in the span of 60 seconds, you're about to. Subscribe to this channel right now and stay with me until the very end, because this story goes places you will not see coming. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The conference room on the 14th floor of Whitmore and Hale legal partners occupied the southwest corner of a glass tower overlooking the Thames. On a clear morning, you could see all the way to Greenwich from the windows. This was not a clear morning. The sky was low and gray, the kind of February overcast that made London feel smaller than it was, more closed in, like the city was holding its breath. Damien Ashcroft had been to this building twice before. Once when his father's estate was being divided after the old man finally died, and once 3 years ago when he'd signed the prenuptial agreement that his attorney had assured him was ironclad. He remembered being mildly annoyed by the prenup at the time, not because he objected to the terms, but because Vivian had asked to read every page herself, slowly, without rushing. She'd taken almost 2 hours. He'd sat in this same building, checking his phone, while his then-fiancée read legal documents like someone who expected to need them one day. He should have paid more attention to that. He was 43 years old, 6 feet tall, with the kind of jaw that photographed well, and the kind of eyes that had learned early how to look sincere without actually being sincere. He wore a charcoal suit that had been tailored in Milan and shoes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He looked, by every external measure, like a man who had already won. Beside him sat Clarissa Vance. She was 31, a commercial interior designer who'd met Damien at a charity gala 18 months ago and had spent the better part of that time being told that the marriage was already over in every way that mattered, that the separation was just paperwork, that it would all be handled quietly. She had believed him. She was still believing him, sitting there in that cream silk blouse with her legs crossed and her handbag balanced on her knee, looking faintly bored in the way that people look when they're trying to appear above the proceedings. Damien's attorney, a compact man named Gerald Fitch, who billed at £900 an hour and had the energy of someone permanently running slightly late, arranged his folders and cleared his throat. "We're still waiting on Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "Ms. Hale," Damien corrected, not looking up from his phone. She went back to her maiden name. "Right, Ms. Hale. Her office confirmed she'd be here by 9. It was 9 past 9. Damien tapped his phone screen, exhaled through his nose. Typical. It wasn't actually typical. In nearly 4 years of marriage, Vivian had never once been late to anything that mattered. She was the kind of person who arrived 10 minutes early and used the extra time to read. But Damien had rewritten the story of their marriage so many times in his own head that he'd started to believe his own edits. The door opened at 9:12. Vivian Hale did not rush. She did not apologize for the time. She walked into the conference room with the measured, unhurried pace of a woman who had decided at some point in the last several months that she was done performing anxiety for anyone's comfort. She was 38, with dark hair pulled back simply, minimal makeup, wearing a navy coat that was professional without being expensive. She looked like herself. That was the thing about her that had always unsettled Damien. She just looked like herself. No performance, no armor, just the steady fact of her presence. She was not alone. Behind her came a young woman, clearly an assistant, carrying a large tote bag. And in Vivian's arms, Damien registered it in pieces. The way Vivian's right arm curved inward, the pale yellow blanket, the small, impossibly small shape bundled against her chest. A baby. Clarissa made a sound. Not quite a word. Something between a breath and the beginning of a question that she couldn't finish. Vivian crossed to the opposite side of the table, sat down, and settled the infant carefully against her shoulder. The baby was asleep. One tiny fist had escaped the blanket and curled near its own cheek. Vivian placed her hand flat against the small back with the automatic steadiness of someone who had been doing this long enough that it no longer required thought, but not so long that the tenderness had worn off. This was a new baby. This was a very new baby. Vivian's attorney, a tall woman named Sylvia Okafor, who Damien had never liked because she never seemed remotely impressed by him, opened her own folders without ceremony. "Good morning," Sylvia said. "Sorry for the slight delay. Shall we begin?" Damien had not moved. He was still staring at the bundle against Vivian's shoulder. "What," he said, "is that?" Vivian looked at him with the particular expression of a woman who has anticipated a question and is not especially interested in the conversation that follows it. "She's 4 weeks old," she said. "Her name is Elena." The room was very quiet. Gerald Fitch shifted in his seat. Clarissa's handbag slid off her knee and hit the floor, and she didn't reach for it. "That's—" Damien stopped, started again. "We've been separated for 11 months. 10 months and 18 days, Vivian said. But we were still legally married when she was conceived." The calculation hit him like a physical thing. He did it involuntarily, reflexively, the numbers rearranging themselves whether he wanted them to or not. 10 months and 18 days. A 4-week-old baby. He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and when he looked back down, something in his face had changed. Not guilt, not yet, something more primitive than guilt. The animal awareness of a situation that had moved beyond his control. "You should have told me," he said. Vivian's expression didn't shift. "I did tell you. I left you 3 voicemails in October. You had your assistant return my call to let me know you were occupied and would respond when you had time." "I didn't know what you were calling about." "No," she agreed. "You didn't, because you didn't call back." Clarissa picked up her handbag from the floor. Her movements were very controlled and very careful, the way people move when they're trying not to broadcast what they're feeling. She set the bag on the table in front of her and looked at Damien with an expression that Damien would spend a long time afterward trying not to think about. "Damien," she said quietly, "is she—" "Don't," he said. "I'm just asking. I said don't." Sylvia Okafor placed both palms flat on the table. "I think it would be useful to acknowledge what's in front of us before we proceed. Ms. Hale gave birth to a daughter 4 weeks ago. The child was conceived during the legal marriage. Ms. Hale is not here to discuss paternity today. That's a separate matter for a separate proceeding. Today's hearing concerns the dissolution of the marriage and the financial settlement, which my client has agreed to in full as outlined in the document you received last Wednesday." She looked at Gerald Fitch. "I trust your client has reviewed the terms." Gerald Fitch was already looking at Damien with the tight, careful expression of an attorney who can see a situation going sideways and is calculating how to get paid regardless. "We have reviewed them, yes." "Then let's proceed." "Wait." Damien leaned forward. His voice had changed. The easy authority was still there, but it was cracked through with something else now. "Vivian." She looked at him. Just looked at him, the way you'd look at someone you used to know. "Is she mine?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. The baby stirred slightly, and she adjusted her hold without breaking eye contact with Damien. "She's mine," she said. "She's entirely mine. Everything she is and everything she needs, that's mine. But if you're asking about biology, yes, she is your biological daughter." The word daughter landed in the room with a weight that no one had prepared for. Damien sat with it. You could see him sitting with it, the way his jaw moved slightly, like he was about to say something, and then thought better of it. Clarissa had gone very still beside him. She was looking at the table in front of her, not at Damien, not at the baby, just at the polished mahogany surface, and her expression had the stunned quality of someone doing very rapid recalculations about a significant portion of the last 18 months of her life. "I have a right to—" Damien began. "You have rights that will be determined by a separate court process," Sylvia said, not unkindly but without any softness either. "What you don't have is the right to halt today's proceedings on those grounds. My client is here to finalize a divorce. She carried a pregnancy alone, delivered a child alone, and has been caring for an infant alone for the past 4 weeks. She is here today because she would like to close this chapter of her life and move forward. I would ask that we allow her to do that." Gerald Fitch leaned over to Damien and spoke very quietly near his ear. Damien listened. His hand on the table had formed a loose fist, and then he consciously flattened it. "Fine," he said. "We proceed." But his eyes kept going back to the baby, to Elena. To the pale yellow blanket and the small fist and the way Vivian held her like the most important thing she had ever done was already accomplished, and nothing in this conference room was capable of diminishing it. The settlement took 2 hours and 40 minutes to finalize. Gerald Fitch made several attempts to renegotiate terms that had already been agreed to in writing, and Sylvia Okafor dismantled each one with the brisk efficiency of someone clearing dishes from a table. Vivian spoke when asked to confirm or clarify. Otherwise, she was quiet, occasionally adjusting Elena's position, once slipping away to the small private room Sylvia had arranged down the hall to feed her, returning 10 minutes later without comment and without any particular expression. Damien watched her more than he watched the documents. He couldn't seem to help it. This was not the Vivian he had told himself he was leaving. The woman he'd built in his own narrative over the past year was someone smaller, someone who needed things he couldn't give, someone whose quietness was a kind of withholding, a passive reproach. He'd told Clarissa early on that his wife was cold, that she'd never really let him in. He'd believed it when he said it. It was easier to believe that than to look at what he'd actually done, which was meet a woman at a charity gala when his marriage was in a rough stretch, pour himself into the excitement of something new, and allow that new thing to become a reason to stop trying at the thing that was harder and older and real. He hadn't known about the baby. He held on to that. He had not known. But Vivian had tried to tell him, and he'd had his assistant return the call. He hadn't known because he hadn't wanted to know. And there was a difference between those two things that he was only now, sitting in this conference room in his 1,200-pound suit, beginning to understand. Clarissa left first. She stood up before the final documents were signed, said she'd wait downstairs, and walked out of the room with her handbag and her cream blouse and her careful face. And Damien watched her go with the look of a man who knows he's going to have to deal with that later, but cannot deal with it now. The papers were signed at 12:17. Sylvia Okafor gathered her documents efficiently. Vivian's assistant helped her with the baby bag. Damien stood up. "Vivian?" She had her back to him, settling Elena into a soft infant carrier strapped against her chest, adjusting the fabric around the baby's head. She turned around when he said her name, but she didn't move toward him. "I didn't know," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. "I know you didn't," she said. "I would have—" "Damien." Her voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't cruel. It was just honest, and honesty sometimes lands harder than cruelty because there's nothing to push back against. "You would have what?" "You had already moved Clarissa into the Mayfair flat by October. You'd stopped answering my calls directly. Whatever you would have done, I thought about it a lot. I thought about it every day for 7 months. And eventually I realized that what you would have done isn't the question anymore. What I'm going to do is the question. She's my daughter. She's a 4-week-old baby who needs consistency and stability and someone who shows up. You're going to have to talk to your attorney about what role you want to play, but that conversation isn't happening today." She glanced at Sylvia, who gave a small nod. "Today is done." She walked to the door. Then she stopped, not because she'd forgotten something, but with the deliberate quality of someone who had decided to say one more thing. "She has your hands," Vivian said, without turning around. "I noticed it when she was born. The shape of her fingers. I thought you should know that." And then she was gone, and the conference room was very quiet, and Damien Ashcroft stood at the head of a mahogany table surrounded by the expensive trappings of a life he had built and then dismantled himself, and the only sound was the faint whisper of the heating system and the distant noise of London 14 floors below. Gerald Fitch was packing his briefcase. He did it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had sat in rooms like this for 30 years and had learned not to absorb the emotional residue. He clicked the clasps shut, straightened up, looked at Damien. "The paternity matter," he said carefully. "If you want to pursue legal recognition, I know what I want to pursue." Damien's voice came out harder than he meant it to. "Set it up. It will take time. Vivian's team will likely request—" "Set it up, Gerald." Gerald Fitch picked up his briefcase. "It's not a straightforward process," he said, "and courts tend to look at—" "I heard you," Damien picked up the unsigned notepad in front of him, the one he hadn't written anything on during the entire 2 hours and 40 minutes of proceedings. He looked at it, set it back down. She said she left me voicemails in October. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Yes. Did your office receive anything? Any correspondence about... We received a letter in late October, Gerald said. He said it in the tone of a man choosing his words with a great deal of care. Your instructions at that time were to route all personal correspondence from Ms. Hale directly to the negotiation file. We were in the middle of settlement discussions, and you'd said, I remember what I said. Damien looked at the window. The Thames was a gray ribbon far below, and a boat moved along it with no urgency at all. I told you not to bother me with it. Gerald Fitch did not confirm or deny this. He did not need to. The letter, Damien said. What did it say? It was brief. It indicated that Ms. Hale needed to speak with you about a personal matter of significant importance. It requested a direct conversation. Damien stood at the window for a long moment. Below him, London moved and turned and breathed, indifferent. She was 4 months pregnant when she wrote that, he said. Not to Gerald, not really to anyone, just the words settling into the air. 4 months pregnant, and she wrote me a letter and I told you to file it. Gerald Fitch had the wisdom not to respond to that. He walked to the door, paused. I'll begin the preliminary work on the paternity filing. We can speak tomorrow. Fine. The door closed softly behind him. Damien stood at the window for a long time. He tried to assemble the thing in a way that reflected better on him. Tried the different angles, the mitigating circumstances, the ways in which he hadn't technically known. He was very good at this kind of mental architecture. He'd been building it for 18 months. But today something kept collapsing the structure before he could finish it. The shape of her fingers. She has your hands. He hadn't even held her. He'd sat 3 feet from his daughter for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and he hadn't held her, hadn't touched her, and now he was standing in an empty conference room 14 floors above the river, and the baby was somewhere in an elevator, or a lobby, or already in a car headed away from him, and he didn't know her voice, and he didn't know her weight, and she had his hands, and he hadn't held her. He pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass of the window and stayed there until the boat on the river disappeared around a bend and was gone. Go. Downstairs in the building's marble lobby, the revolving door pushed Vivian out into the February air. The cold hit her face and she exhaled, slowly, deliberately, the breath she had been holding in some form or another since 9:12 that morning. Elena stirred against her chest, made a small sound, settled again. Car's waiting, said Miriam, her assistant, appearing beside her. Give me a minute. Miriam gave her a minute. She'd been with Vivian for 3 years, and she understood the difference between a minute that was about logistics and a minute that was about something else. The city moved around her. People with briefcases and coffees and purposes of their own. A bus rumbled past. Pigeons arranged and rearranged themselves on the railing across the street. The Thames was 2 blocks east, and you could smell it faintly. That cold river smell that meant London even when you couldn't see the water. Vivian looked down at Elena's head, the dark fuzz of hair against the carrier fabric. Okay, she said quietly. To herself, or to the baby, or to something she needed to say out loud. Okay. That was it. That was all of it. The entire compressed weight of a marriage that had started with genuine hope and ended in a conference room with signed documents and cool professional language. 4 years of her life, the last 7 months of which she'd spent growing a child in a body she had to explain to no one, with a due date she tracked alone. In a flat she'd return to in the evenings to cook something simple and sit by the window and read, because there was nothing else to do, and she was not someone who fell apart easily. She was, however, someone who got tired. Very deeply tired. In a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The car was a gray sedan waiting at the curb. The driver, an older man named Paul, who'd been working for her since before the marriage, spotted her and got out to open the door. Ready, Miss Hale? Yes, she said. Let's go home. She ducked into the back seat, settled Elena with practiced efficiency, and as Paul pulled into traffic and the glass tower of Whitmore and Hale receded behind them, Vivian Hale looked out the window at the gray London morning and did not cry. She had been too busy for grief. She was still too busy. But somewhere in the quiet of the moving car, with the baby breathing against her and the city sliding past the glass, she let herself feel, just briefly, just for the length of a few blocks, what the last year had actually cost her. Then she smoothed the blanket over Elena's feet and took out her phone to check her afternoon schedule. There was work to be done. There always was. And she had stopped waiting for anyone else to do it for her. Part 2. The flat Vivian had moved into 8 months ago was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian building in Islington, and it was smaller than anything she'd lived in since her mid-20s. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that shared space with the living area, windows that looked out onto a quiet street lined with plane trees. She'd chosen it deliberately, not because she couldn't afford something larger, but because she'd spent 4 years in a house that had 6 bedrooms and a wine cellar and a formal dining room they used maybe 4 times a year, and somewhere in the middle of all that space, she had become very lonely in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. The small flat felt like hers. That mattered more than she'd expected. She'd set up Elena's corner in the 2nd bedroom before the birth, keeping it simple. A crib, a changing table, a chair for the night feedings. No elaborate nursery theme, no color-coordinated bedding sets, just the things they needed. Miriam had brought over a casserole dish the week she came home from the hospital, left it on the doorstep with a note that said, "Don't thank me, just eat it." And Vivian had eaten it over the course of 3 days, and it was one of the most genuinely comforting things anyone had done for her in a long time. Her mother had come down from Edinburgh for 10 days after Elena was born. They had what you'd call a functional relationship. Her mother was not an effusive woman, had never been, but she was practical and steady, and she did laundry and cooked breakfast and held the baby so Vivian could sleep in 3-hour stretches. And she didn't ask too many questions about Damien except once, on the 6th day, when she looked up from folding a small white onesie and said, "Are you all right? Actually all right?" And Vivian had said, "I will be." And her mother had nodded once and gone back to the folding. It was an honest answer, not reassuring but honest, and they had always done better with honesty than reassurance. By the time of the divorce hearing, her mother had gone back north. Miriam came twice a week to help with logistics, scheduling, correspondence, the smaller administrative threads of Vivian's consulting work, which she'd quietly been rebuilding during the pregnancy. Vivian was a project management consultant who'd spent 6 years before the marriage building a solid client base in sustainable development, then spent 4 years inside the marriage letting it go quieter and quieter as Damien's world absorbed more and more of her calendar. It wasn't something he'd demanded. It was something she'd allowed, incrementally, the way you allow things that happen slowly enough that you don't notice the accumulation until you're standing in a house with 6 bedrooms, wondering where the last 4 years went. She was rebuilding. Slowly, between feeds and naps and the relentless logistics of keeping a newborn alive, she was rebuilding. But the morning of the divorce, when Paul drove her home from Whitmore and Hale, and she got Elena upstairs and settled her in the crib, and stood in the kitchen trying to remember if she'd eaten anything since 6 a.m., the tiredness hit her with a particular weight. Not the physical kind, or not only that, the other kind. The kind that comes after you've been holding yourself together across a high-stakes morning, and the performance is finally over and there's nobody watching, and your body decides that now is when it's going to present the bill. She stood at the kitchen counter and drank a glass of water and ate 4 crackers from the packet on the shelf and looked at her phone. 3 missed calls from her mother, a text from Sylvia that said, "Well done today, call me tomorrow." 2 emails from clients. And nothing, of course, from Damien. It was too soon for that, the day wasn't even over, but she noticed the nothing the way you notice it, that small involuntary check and then the small correction. She put the phone face down on the counter. She had not expected to feel this particular texture of sadness. She'd expected relief, and there was relief, a genuine structural relief, the relief of a thing finally done. But there was also something else underneath it that she didn't have a clean name for. Not grief for Damien. She'd done most of that grieving months ago, in the specific silent way of people who grieve things while they're still technically inside them. It was more like grief for what she'd believed the marriage was going to be. For the version of her life she'd planned at 34 when she'd said yes in a small restaurant in Notting Hill on a rainy Tuesday in November. And the way she'd meant it, completely, without reservation. She'd meant it. That was the thing she kept returning to, not as accusation, but as fact. She had loved him without performance, and he had. She thought he had too, at first. In the early years, there had been something real there. She hadn't imagined it, but somewhere between years 2 and 3, something had shifted in him. Some restlessness had taken hold, and she'd tried to name it and address it and be patient with it and talk about it, and eventually she'd just gotten very, very tired. Elena made a sound from the bedroom. The particular sound that meant not quite awake yet, just stirring, just checking. Vivian listened, counted to 15, and the sound stopped. She exhaled. "Okay," she said to the kitchen. "Okay." She put the crackers away, drank a second glass of water, and sat down at her small desk by the window to look at her emails. She did not let herself sit still in the sadness. That had never been her way. Not because the sadness wasn't real, but because staying inside it without moving felt like something she couldn't afford right now. She had a 4-week-old and a business to rebuild, and a life that was entirely her own responsibility. She would feel things. She was feeling things. But she would also send the email to the client in Bristol and review the project timeline for the firm in Manchester and eat something before 4 o'clock. She had learned in the last year that keeping going and falling apart were not opposites. You could do both. You just had to manage the schedule. She was on her second email when Elena woke up properly, with the full-throated declaration of an infant who has decided that waiting is no longer acceptable. Vivian saved the draft, went to the bedroom, picked her up, and the smell of her, that specific warm, close smell of a newborn that hit somewhere below rational thought, loosened something in her chest that she hadn't realized she was still clenching. "Hello," she said. "I know, terrible morning." Elena blinked at her with the unfocused intensity of someone who has recently arrived and is still forming opinions. "You'll be fine," Vivian said, settling into the chair. "We both will." She wasn't entirely sure she believed it yet, but she was working on it. She didn't know, sitting in that chair in her small Islington flat, with a 4-week-old in her arms and a half-drafted email on her screen, and the emotional residue of a 2-hour, 40-minute divorce proceeding still sitting in her chest, that the next few hours were going to introduce her to someone who would change the particular shape of the life she was trying to build. She wasn't looking. That's the thing people always forget to mention. You're never looking when it happens. You're just tired and hungry and standing in front of a courthouse trying to get a car seat buckled with one hand, which is exactly where she was at 3:47 that afternoon. She'd had to go back out. Sylvia's office had called to say that 2 additional documents needed wet signatures before 5 o'clock, administrative paperwork that had been overlooked in the morning's proceedings, and could Vivian stop by? It was Vivian's fault, technically. She'd missed the flagged section in the final document package because Elena had needed to be repositioned and she'd lost her page. Sylvia's assistant was entirely gracious about it, but Vivian got off the phone feeling the specific low-grade irritation of someone who is already operating at the edge of their capacity and has just added one more thing. She bundled Elena back into the carrier, put on her coat, and walked to the tube station. She should have taken a cab. She knew that even as she was deciding against it, a stubborn practicality overriding the more sensible option. The tube was fine. She'd managed the tube pregnant. She could manage it with a 4-week-old. The tube was not fine. It wasn't a disaster. It was just the ordinary accumulation of small difficulties that compounds when you are alone and tired and carrying a person who has no concept of inconvenience. The elevator at her station was out of service. She navigated the stairs with the car seat in one hand and the baby bag on her shoulder, and a woman behind her who sighed audibly when Vivian needed an extra moment at the bottom. The central line was delayed 8 minutes. Elena, who had been calm on the walk to the station, decided the platform was the right setting to express an opinion about life in general. Vivian rocked her, spoke quietly, maintained the expression of someone who is not about to lose it in a public space, and counted the minutes on the board. She made it to Sylvia's office with 12 minutes to spare, signed the documents, spent 5 minutes accepting a cup of tea from Sylvia's assistant, who seemed to understand, without being told, that it was needed, and then came back downstairs into the cold afternoon. The problem with the car seat happened on the pavement outside the building. It was a good car seat. She'd researched it extensively. But the locking mechanism had a tendency, in cold weather, to require more force than the manual suggested, and Vivian had one hand occupied with Elena in the carrier, and the angle was wrong. And she had been awake since 5 a.m. and had eaten 4 crackers and part of a cup of tea, and the latch would not click. She tried it 3 times. Reset it, tried again. The car seat sat in the dock on the taxi she'd called, and the latch would not click, and a small sound came from somewhere near the base of her throat that was not quite frustration and not quite anything else, just the sound a person makes when the body is briefly ahead of the decision to keep it together. That one's a nightmare in the cold. The red button on the side. Press that first, then the main latch. She hadn't heard him approach. He was standing about 2 feet to her right, not crowding her, not reaching for the car seat, just indicating with a slight gesture the secondary release button on the left side panel. She looked at him. Medium height, maybe 40, wearing a dark coat that had seen some weather, carrying a takeaway coffee and a laptop bag. Not remarkable in any specific way. He was looking at the car seat, not at her, with the expression of someone who has fought this particular battle before. "My nephew," he said, by way of explanation. "Same model. Took me 4 tries the first time. Cold weather makes the mechanism stiff." Vivian looked back at the car seat, pressed the red button, pressed the main latch. It clicked. She stood up. "Thank you." "No problem." He lifted his coffee, started to move on. "Seriously," she said, because something made her want to actually say it rather than let it be just a reflex. "That was... thank you. It's been a day." He glanced back at her. There was something in his face that wasn't pity. She was very attuned to pity, had been receiving it in low doses from various people for months, and had developed a fairly precise sensitivity to it. It was more like recognition. The look of someone who has had their own version of a day and doesn't need to make it a thing. "Those happen," he said. He looked at the baby in the carrier briefly, then back at her face. "Is there anything else you need? A hand with the bag?" "I'm all right, but thank you." He nodded, walked on. Vivian got into the cab, got Elena settled, and sat back against the seat. Through the window, she could see him walking away, the dark coat moving through the foot traffic on the pavement, disappearing around the corner. She didn't think much about it. She was too tired, and Elena was starting to make the pre-hunger sounds, and Paul was navigating afternoon traffic with the measured patience of a man who had been driving in London for 30 years. Vivian looked out the window and tried to calculate whether there was anything in the flat that didn't require cooking. It wasn't until later, much later, weeks later, that she would understand that the car seat on the cold pavement was where a certain part of her story started over. His name was Adrian Cross, and he didn't know hers yet. He'd spent that morning in meetings at the offices of a company he'd recently invested in, a climate technology startup in Clerkenwell that was run by a 29-year-old who had too many good ideas and not enough organizational discipline. And Adrian had spent 2 hours trying to help him understand that brilliance without structure was just expensive chaos. The meeting had gone reasonably well. The 29-year-old had pushed back on 3 of his suggestions, accepted 2, and conceded to revisit 1, which Adrian considered a functional outcome. He'd walked to Sylvia Okafor's building entirely by accident. He was heading to another meeting 2 streets over and had taken a wrong turn because he'd been reading a message on his phone, which he knew better than to do while walking, and did anyway, and had corrected himself by cutting through the street where the car seat was not locking. He thought about the woman for a moment afterward. Not at length, just briefly. The way you think about people you encounter in small human moments that don't go anywhere. She'd looked exhausted in the way that new parents look exhausted. That particular texture of tiredness that's different from regular tiredness and somehow both worse and more purposeful. She'd also looked, underneath the exhaustion, like someone who was going to be completely fine and was not especially interested in anyone's assessment of whether or not that was true. He let it go and went to his meeting. He was 41 years old, ran a technology consulting firm he'd built from a 3-person operation in a shared office in Shoreditch into a 40-person company with offices in London, Amsterdam, and Singapore. He was not a billionaire. People sometimes assume this, because he operated at the level where billionaires were common enough to lose their impressiveness, and he had the particular ease of someone who had stopped being anxious about money several years ago. But he wasn't Damien Ashcroft. He didn't own buildings. He didn't have attorneys who returned his wife's calls through assistants. He had, until about 14 months ago, been in a relationship with a woman named Harriet, who was a documentary filmmaker and very smart and genuinely funny and wanted, more than anything else, to be in New York, where she had grown up and where her entire creative community existed. The relationship had ended without rancor and without drama, and with a genuine mutual acknowledgement that they were not, in the end, going to choose each other over their respective cities. He missed her sometimes. He didn't mistake that for a reason to have made a different decision. He had a sister in Bristol, a nephew who was 3, and a mother in Warwickshire who called every Sunday and asked him whether he was eating enough vegetables, which he found both annoying and obscurely comforting. He was, at the time of the car seat on the pavement, in a reasonable stretch of his life. Not perfect. He was working too many hours and was overdue for a proper holiday, and had a complicated situation with one of his investors that was going to require a difficult conversation. But functional, forward-moving, not unhappy. He did not go looking for things to change that. So, the thing that brought them into the same space again was not fate or coincidence or any of the narrative shortcuts that stories reach for. It was a mutual acquaintance, a man named David Cho, who ran a co-working space in Farringdon and who knew Vivian through a sustainable development network and knew Adrian through 3 years of shared office infrastructure, and who had invited both of them to the same informal networking event on a Thursday evening in early March, 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Vivian had almost not gone. Elena was 6 weeks old, which was still very young, but her mother had come back down for a long weekend and had essentially removed the baby from her arms at 5:30 and said, "Go, get out, talk to adults," with the decisive air of a woman who had raised a child herself and understood that the person doing it needed to occasionally be somewhere other than inside it. She'd arrived late, found David near the drinks table, and been guided into 3 conversations in quick succession about project methodology and sustainable supply chains and a government infrastructure initiative that was potentially interesting. She'd drunk 1 glass of wine and switched to sparkling water and noticed, in the way she always noticed things, where the exits were and who was talking to whom, and how many conversations were genuine versus performative. She was standing near the window. She tended toward walls and windows at events, perimeter positions from which you could see the room without being in the middle of it, when David materialized beside her with Adrian Cross in tow. "Adrian, this is Vivian Hale. She runs her own consulting practice, sustainable development and project management." Vivian, Adrian Cross. He runs Cross Technologies, tech infrastructure and investment. And Adrian Cross looked at her with the particular expression of a man who recognizes someone and is not entirely certain from where. "We've met," he said. "Have we met?" Vivian looked at him. Dark coat, different tonight, now a jacket, no laptop bag, but the same face. The person from the pavement, the car seat. "Outside Sylvia Okafor's building," she said. "About 6 weeks ago. You explained the locking mechanism." His face cleared. "Right. Yes. The cold." He looked genuinely pleased to have placed it. How did the rest of the day go? It was such a specific question, not, "How have you been?" or "Good to properly meet you." How did the rest of that particular day go? As if he'd actually registered that it was a difficult one and was curious whether it had improved. "Better," she said. "Eventually." "Good." He didn't push it further, didn't make it a thing, just accepted the answer and shifted naturally. "David says you work in sustainable development. What kind of projects?" She told him. He listened, actually listened. Not the kind of listening where someone is waiting for their turn to speak, but the kind where they're following the actual thread. He asked a question about a methodology she'd mentioned, a genuine question that showed he'd understood what she said and wanted to know more. She answered it. He had a perspective on the adjacent technology side that she hadn't considered. She pushed back on one of his assumptions. He thought about it, conceded the point, offered a modification. It was, she realized about 20 minutes in, the best professional conversation she'd had in several months, maybe longer. "Can I ask," he said at a pause. The baby from the pavement. 6 weeks old. Elena. You look considerably less like someone about to... He stopped. Reconsidered the end of the sentence. About to what? I was going to say about to have an extremely difficult evening, but that seemed presumptuous in retrospect. Despite everything, despite the wine she wasn't drinking and the tiredness that was still fundamentally present underneath the networking event, she found herself almost smiling. No, you read it correctly. It was an extremely difficult evening in progress. Newly born and sole caregiver? Is it that obvious? Not the sole caregiver part, just the... He made a slight gesture. The person managing everything themselves. She looked at him for a moment. She was good at reading people, had always been, had gotten considerably better at it in the last year, and what she read in him was uncomplicated. Not working an angle, not performing, just someone making conversation with the honest awareness of what he was looking at. Her father is not in the picture, she said, because it was simpler than the truth, and the truth wasn't appropriate for a Thursday networking event. Not yet, anyway. He nodded. Let it sit at that. And you're back working already? Working and figuring out childcare and resurrecting a client list and approximately 40 other things simultaneously. Yes. Is the 40 manageable? She considered. Ask me in 6 months. I'll remember to. She looked at him. He said it like he meant it, not as a social pleasantry but as an actual intention. Like he expected they would know each other in 6 months, not as a certainty but as a natural possibility. She didn't know what to do with that, so she changed the subject back to project methodology, and they talked for another 15 minutes before David pulled Adrian away to meet someone else, and Adrian said, "Good to properly meet you, Vivian," and moved away into the room, and Vivian stood at the window with her sparkling water and the faint surprise of someone who had arrived at an event expecting nothing in particular and found something she hadn't been looking for. She didn't name what it was. She was extremely cautious about naming things too quickly. That particular caution was new or newly sharpened, and she wasn't ready to set it aside yet. She finished her water, said goodbye to David, and went home to her mother and her daughter in the quiet flat in Islington. In Mayfair, in the apartment that he'd moved Clarissa into back in September, things were considerably less quiet. Clarissa had not left the day of the hearing. She'd waited in the lobby, as she said she would, and Damien had come down an hour after the signing, and they'd gotten into a car together, and she'd been very controlled and very cool the whole ride home, and that control had lasted until approximately 8 o'clock that evening when the control stopped. "You told me the pregnancy was impossible," she said. They were in the kitchen. Damien was at the counter with a glass of whiskey and his tie loosened, and Clarissa was standing by the table with nothing in her hands and her arms crossed, and this was already the third loop of this particular conversation, but neither of them had found their way out of it yet. "You specifically said you'd been told it was very unlikely. That's what you told me." "That's what I believed." "Then how—" "I don't know, Clarissa. These things happen. I'm not a doctor." "That's not—" She stopped, started again. "There is a baby. There is a child who is apparently your biological daughter. She was born a month ago, and you're telling me you didn't know." "I'm telling you I didn't know." "You got a letter in October." "My attorney received a letter. I had it filed." "You had it filed." She said it flatly, like she was reading it back off a transcript. "Your ex-wife, your still legally married wife, sent you a letter saying she needed to speak with you urgently, and you had it filed." He didn't answer. There wasn't a good answer. He knew there wasn't, and he was tired enough that he'd stopped trying to construct one. "I want to know," Clarissa said, carefully, "where that leaves us." Damien looked at his glass. "I don't know yet. That's not good enough. It's what I have right now." He looked up at her. "I found out I had a daughter today. Across a table with a room full of attorneys 4 hours ago. I'm asking you to give me more than 4 hours." Something moved through Clarissa's face, not softening, but something more complicated than simple anger. She was a smart woman. She'd known that from the beginning, and it was one of the reasons he'd been drawn to her. Smart enough to know that some of what she was feeling right now was not entirely about Damien or the baby, but about the version of the situation she'd agreed to walk into and the version that had actually materialized. I need you to be honest with me, she said. Not about the baby. About Vivian. I'm not going back to Vivian. That's not what I asked. She waited. Do you still have feelings for her? Damien was quiet for a long moment. He finished his whiskey, put the glass down. I have... He stopped. What I feel is complicated. What happened today was complicated. I'm not in love with my ex-wife, but I sat in a room today and watched her with a child I didn't know I had, and she was... He stopped again. She was completely fine. She was more than fine. And I don't know how to feel about that yet. Clarissa looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her coat from the back of the chair and her handbag from the table. I'm going to stay at my sister's tonight, she said. Clarissa, I'm not ending anything. I need one night where I'm not in this flat having this conversation. She walked to the door, stopped. You should know, she said without turning around, that I have never once in the 18 months we've been together asked you to choose. I went along with everything at whatever pace you needed. I believed what you told me. She turned then, just slightly, enough that he could see her profile. So whatever you're figuring out, figure it out honestly. That's all I'm asking. The door closed. Damien stood in the kitchen, poured another finger of whiskey, didn't drink it. Somewhere across the city, in a flat in Islington, a 6-week-old named Elena was sleeping. And Damien Ashcroft, who had spent 18 months telling himself a particular story about his life and his choices and what he deserved, stood in the apartment he'd been so eager to get to and tried to figure out how to carry the weight of what he'd thrown away without even knowing what it was. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure there was one that would do him any credit. He left the whiskey on the counter and went to bed and lay in the dark for a long time before sleep came. And when it did, it wasn't restful. The flat Vivian had moved into 8 months ago was on the 3rd floor of a converted Victorian building in Islington, and it was smaller than anything she'd lived in since her mid-20s. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that shared space with the living area, windows that looked out onto a quiet street lined with plane trees that were bare in February and would be full again by April, which she found herself looking forward to in a way that surprised her. She'd chosen the flat deliberately, not because she couldn't afford something larger, but because she'd spent 4 years in a house that had 6 bedrooms and a wine cellar and a formal dining room they'd used maybe 4 times a year, and somewhere in the middle of all that space, she had become very lonely in a way that had nothing to do with square footage. The small flat felt like hers. That mattered more than she'd expected it to. She'd set up Elena's corner of the 2nd bedroom before the birth, keeping it deliberate and spare. A crib, a changing table, a nursing chair with arms wide enough to actually be useful at 3 in the morning. No elaborate nursery theme, no color-coordinated bedding sets in shades someone else had decided babies should prefer. Just the things they needed, arranged in a way that made sense. Miriam had brought over a casserole dish the week she came home from the hospital, left it on the doorstep with a note that said, "Don't thank me, just eat it." And Vivian had eaten it slowly over the course of 3 days, and it was one of the most genuinely comforting things anyone had done for her in recent memory. Her mother had come down from Edinburgh for 10 days after Elena arrived. They had what you'd charitably call a functional relationship. Her mother, Margaret, was not an effusive woman, had never been, and she expressed affection primarily through action rather than language. She did laundry and cooked breakfast and held the baby in the early evenings so Vivian could sleep in 3-hour stretches, and she didn't ask too many questions about Damien except once, on the 6th evening when she'd looked up from folding a small white onesie and said, "Are you all right? Actually all right?" And Vivian had said, "I will be." And Margaret had nodded once and gone back to the folding because she understood the difference between a reassurance and a commitment, and she'd heard a commitment. It was an honest answer, not comforting in the way people want honesty to be comforting, but real, and they had always done better with reality than with softening. By the time of the divorce hearing, Margaret had gone back north. Miriam came twice a week to help with the administrative threads of Vivian's consulting work, which she'd been quietly rebuilding during the pregnancy in the spaces between everything else. Vivian was a project management consultant who'd spent 6 years before the marriage building a solid client base in sustainable development, infrastructure planning, supply chain accountability, the kind of work that required both analytical rigor and the ability to sit in a room with people who disagreed and hold the process steady. She'd been good at it. Then she'd spent 4 years inside the marriage, letting the work go quieter and quieter as Damien's world absorbed more and more of her calendar. It wasn't something he'd demanded explicitly. It was something she'd allowed in the way you allow things that happen gradually enough that you don't notice the accumulation until you look up, and the work that used to define you has become a small side operation you fit in around someone else's schedule. She was building it back. That was the word she preferred over rebuilding. It implied something different, less about restoration and more about construction. What she was making now wasn't a return to what she'd had before. It was something new, shaped by everything that had happened since. But on the afternoon of the divorce, when Paul drove her home from Whitmore and Hale, and she got Elena upstairs and settled her in the crib and stood in the kitchen trying to remember whether she'd eaten anything since 6 in the morning, the tiredness hit her with a specific and unambiguous weight. Not just the physical kind, though that was substantial. She was 4 weeks postpartum, still running on fragmented sleep, still navigating the particular bodily strangeness of having grown and delivered a person. The other kind of tiredness, too. The kind that arrives after you've been holding yourself together through a high-stakes performance, and the audience has finally gone home, and you're alone with the room and the mess and the fact that the performance required something you won't get back. She drank a glass of water, ate 4 crackers from the packet on the counter, looked at her phone. 3 missed calls from her mother. A text from Sylvia that said, "Well done today. Call me tomorrow." 2 emails from clients. And nothing from Damien, which was not surprising. The ink on the papers was barely dry, and besides, what would he say? But she noticed the nothing anyway, the small involuntary check, and then the small voluntary correction. She put the phone face down and went back to her desk. The sadness, when it came, had a texture she hadn't entirely predicted. She'd anticipated relief, and the relief was real, a genuine structural relief. The feeling of a door finally closing on a room you'd been standing in the threshold of for almost a year. But alongside it was something else that didn't have a clean name. Not grief for Damien, the person, exactly. She'd processed most of that during the pregnancy, in the long, specific way that people grieve things while they're still technically inside them, in the evenings when she'd cook something simple and sit by the window with a book and feel the baby move and think about how strange it was to be building a life towards someone new while letting another one go. What she was feeling now was more like grief for the belief she'd carried in at 34 when she'd said yes in that small restaurant in Notting Hill on a rainy Tuesday in November. The belief that she had found the person she was going to do everything with. She had meant it. That was the part she kept coming back to, not as accusation but as plain fact. She had loved him without reservation or performance, and in the beginning she thought he had too. In years 1 and 2 there had been something genuinely good between them. She hadn't invented it, but somewhere in year 3, something in him had started pulling toward a horizon she couldn't see, and she'd tried to name it and address it and be patient with it, and eventually she'd just gotten very tired of being the only one in the room who was still trying. Elena made a sound from the bedroom, the specific half-awake sound, just checking. Vivian listened, counted 12 seconds, and the sound settled. She exhaled. She did not let herself stay inside the sadness for long. That had never been her nature, not because the sadness wasn't real, but because she'd learned, somewhere in the last 8 months, that grief and forward motion weren't opposites. You could carry both. You just had to be honest about what you were carrying. She was on her second client email when Elena woke up properly, with the full-throated declaration of someone who has decided that patience is no longer on offer. Vivian saved the draft, went to the bedroom and picked her up, and the smell of her. That particular warm, close smell of a very young infant that bypasses the rational brain entirely, loosened something in her chest that she hadn't realized she was still holding. "I know," she said. "It was a long morning." Elena regarded her with the solemn, slightly cross-eyed focus of someone who is still calibrating the world and finds it occasionally unsatisfactory. "We're going to be fine," Vivian said. She meant it. She wasn't entirely sure she felt it yet, but she meant it, and she'd learned that meaning something was often where feeling it eventually started. She didn't know, sitting in that chair in her small Islington flat, with the February light going thin outside, and a half-drafted email on the screen and the emotional residue of 2 hours and 40 minutes of divorce proceedings still sitting somewhere in her sternum, that the afternoon was going to send her back out into the city, and that what happened on a pavement outside a law office building in the late afternoon cold would matter later in ways she couldn't yet see. She wasn't looking for anything. She was just tired and behind on her paperwork and trying to figure out what was in the flat that didn't require cooking, which is exactly the condition a person is in, generally, when things that matter find them. Sylvia's office called at 2:30. 2 documents had been missed in the morning signing, an administrative oversight in the final package, a flagged section Vivian had lost her place on when Elena needed repositioning, and the papers needed wet signatures before 5 o'clock. Sylvia's assistant was gracious about it. Vivian got off the phone feeling the specific low-grade friction of someone already operating at the edge of their bandwidth who has just been handed one more thing to do. She should have called a cab. She knew that even as she was making the other decision, some residual practicality pushing back against the sensible option. The tube was manageable. She'd navigated it pregnant. She could navigate it now. The elevator at her tube station was out of service. She managed the stairs with the carrier on her chest and the baby bag on her shoulder, and a woman behind her who exhaled audibly when Vivian needed an extra moment at the bottom, and Vivian did not turn around to look at her, which took a degree of restraint she would not receive credit for. The central line ran 8 minutes behind. Elena, who had been content through the walk and the stairs, decided the platform was the appropriate venue for expressing a general dissatisfaction with the state of things, and Vivian rocked her and spoke quietly and held the expression of someone who is not about to lose it in a public space, and waited. She made it to Sylvia's building with 11 minutes to spare, signed both documents, drank half a cup of tea that Sylvia's assistant brought without being asked, a small kindness that Vivian registered and appreciated more than she could have explained, and came back downstairs into the cold gray 4 o'clock light. The problem with the car seat happened on the pavement. It was a good seat. She'd researched it for weeks during the pregnancy, read every review, watched instructional videos. But the locking mechanism had a documented tendency in cold weather to require significantly more force than the manual suggested, and she had one hand occupied with Elena in the carrier, and the angle against the taxi door was wrong, and she had been awake since 5 and had eaten 4 crackers and half a cup of tea, and the latch would not catch. She tried it 3 times, repositioned the seat, tried again, and something in her throat made a sound that wasn't quite frustration. It was the sound a person makes when the body gets briefly ahead of the decision to hold it together, just one small, involuntary signal that the reserves are running low. That model's a problem in the cold. There's a secondary release on the side panel, the red button. Press that first, then go for the main latch. She hadn't heard him approach. He was standing a couple of feet to her right, not close enough to crowd, not reaching for the seat, just indicating with a slight tilt of his head the left side panel. Dark coat. A laptop bag over one shoulder. A coffee going cold in his hand. Somewhere around 40, unremarkable in presentation, with the slightly distracted look of someone who'd been in meetings all day and was between places. She looked at where he was indicating. Pressed the red button. Pressed the main latch. It caught. She straightened up. "Thank you." "My sister's kid has the same one," he said. "Took me 3 attempts in a supermarket car park to figure that out. Not my finest moment." "Mine either." She looked at him briefly. "It's been a day." "Those happen." He glanced at Elena, just briefly, not intrusively, the quick acknowledgement of someone registering a situation rather than inspecting it, then back at her face. "Is there anything else? The bag?" "I'm all right, thank you. Genuinely." He nodded, lifted his coffee slightly, a minimal acknowledgement, and moved on into the foot traffic. Vivian got into the cab, got herself and Elena settled, sat back. Through the window she could see him already half a block away, the dark coat moving at the unhurried pace of someone who walks in London the way Londoners do, as if the city belongs to them and they've stopped noticing it. He turned a corner and was gone. She didn't think about it for long. Elena was making sounds, Paul was pulling into traffic, and she was running a mental inventory of what was in the refrigerator. By the time they reached Islington, she had moved on entirely, her attention absorbed back into the practical machinery of the evening ahead. It would be 6 weeks before she saw him again. And when she did, in a crowded room in Farringdon over a glass of sparkling water, she was nursing more for something to do with her hands than any actual thirst. She would feel, Not the thing she expected to feel, which was nothing in particular, but a small, specific recognition, like something that had already started in one place continuing somewhere else. His name was Adrian Cross, and at the time of the car seat, he didn't know hers. He'd been in Clerkenwell all morning with a startup founder named Ben Yao, who was 29 years old and had built something genuinely impressive on the technical side, and was actively resisting the organizational structures that would allow it to scale. Adrian had spent 2 hours in patient, sometimes pointed, negotiation about whether structure was synonymous with bureaucracy, which in his experience it was not, and they had reached a modified agreement on 2 of the 4 points he'd raised and tabled the other 2 for the following week, which he considered a reasonable outcome for a first serious push. He'd been walking to his next meeting, had taken a wrong turning while reading a message, a habit he knew better than to have and maintained anyway, and had self-corrected by cutting through the street where a woman was standing on a cold pavement outside a glass office building, trying to lock a car seat with one hand occupied in the wrong angle, and making the very quiet sound of someone at the end of a longer day than anyone around her could see. He'd noticed the car seat model because his sister's boy used the same one, and he'd personally wrestled with the cold weather mechanism in a Sainsbury's car park in December while his sister was inside, and he was in charge of getting Noah strapped in, and he'd stood there for an embarrassing length of time before a passing woman in her 60s had stopped and shown him the secondary release button with the specific patience of someone who has watched a lot of adults struggle unnecessarily. He thought about the woman on the pavement afterward briefly. She'd had the look of someone managing considerably more than the current situation, but managing it without advertising the fact, which was a particular kind of composure he tended to notice and respect. And she'd said thank you like she meant it, not reflexively. He let it go and went to his meeting. Adrian Cross, at 41, was not someone who spent significant time examining his own life for meaning. He was self-aware in the practical sense. He knew his tendencies, his gaps, the ways in which he was occasionally too transactional in relationships and not always good at slowing down enough to notice what was happening in front of him. His last serious relationship had ended 14 months ago. Harriet was a documentary filmmaker, brilliant and funny, and deeply attached to New York in the way that some people are attached to the cities that formed them. And they had been good together in many ways, but not quite good enough in the specific way that matters. And when the conversation finally came, it had been honest and mutual and genuinely sad in a way that Adrian had respected even as he was in the middle of it. He didn't confuse missing someone with having made the wrong choice. He missed Harriet. He'd made the right choice. Both things were true, and neither canceled the other. He had a sister in Bristol named Claire, and a nephew who had just turned 3, and an opinion about everything, and a mother in Warwickshire who called every Sunday and asked if he was eating enough vegetables, which annoyed him and also reassured him in equal measure. He ran a 40-person technology consulting firm with offices in London, Amsterdam, and Singapore that he'd started in a 3-room shared space in Shoreditch a decade ago, and the work still interested him, which he considered a significant piece of luck. He was, in the period surrounding the pavement and the car seat, in what he'd call a functional stretch. Not exceptional. He was working more hours than he should and hadn't had a proper holiday in 8 months, and had a complex situation with an investor named Graham that was going to require a difficult conversation he kept scheduling and then pushing, but functional, oriented, not unhappy. He went to the Thursday networking event in Farringdon because David Cho had personally invited him, and Adrian liked David and owed him a favor from a referral the previous autumn. He did not expect it to be a particularly significant evening. He expected to drink 1 beer, have a handful of reasonable conversations, and leave before 9. He was standing near the drinks table talking to an architect named Marcus about material supply chains when David materialized with a woman Adrian didn't immediately recognize. She was wearing a dark green jacket and had her hair down, which was different, and she looked, not rested exactly, but less close to the edge than the last time he'd seen her. "Adrian, this is Vivian Hale," David said. "She runs her own consulting practice, sustainable development, project management, that whole space. Vivian, this is Adrian Cross, Cross Technologies, tech infrastructure and investment." And Vivian looked at him with a slight narrowing of attention, the expression of someone placing something. "We've met," Adrian said, because he was realizing it even as he said it. "Haven't we?" "Outside Sylvia Okafor's building," she said. 6 weeks ago. The car seat." His face cleared. "The red button." "The red button." "How did the rest of that day go?" She looked at him for a moment, not the polite social half-second, an actual moment, like she was deciding whether the question deserved a real answer. Better, eventually. Good, he said, and didn't push further. David moved on to someone else, which he did with the practiced ease of a man who curates rooms for a living and knows when two people have enough to say to each other. Adrian and Vivian were left with a small, natural silence, which neither of them filled immediately with the anxious small talk of people who aren't comfortable with silence. David said sustainable development, Adrian said. What kind of projects? She told him. He listened, actually followed the thread of it, asked a question about the methodology she'd referenced that showed he'd understood what she'd said rather than just heard it. She answered. He knew the technology side of adjacent infrastructure projects well enough to have a perspective that was genuinely different from hers, and he said so, and she pushed back on one of his assumptions with the specific calibrated directness of someone who has been in enough meetings to know that agreeing to be wrong later is worse than being honest now. He thought about what she'd said, adjusted his position. She accepted the adjustment without making a thing of it. 20 minutes went by without either of them noticing. Can I ask about the baby? He said in a natural pause. Not intrusively, he'd let it go this long, which meant he'd been waiting for the right opening rather than the first one. 6 weeks now? 7. Elena. You look... He stopped, reconsidered the end of that sentence. Considerably less like someone at the end of a terrible day? That's the one. There was something almost like a smile at the corner of her mouth. It was a genuinely terrible day, you can say so. I didn't want to presume. You weren't wrong. She looked at her water glass. The morning was the hard part. The car seat was just the end of it. He waited in case there was more. When there wasn't, he didn't press. You're back working already? Working, managing childcare, rebuilding a client base, finding out what a locking mechanism looks like when it's cold. Among other things. How many things total? Right now, somewhere between 30 and 50, depending on the day. Is it manageable? She looked at him. It was a direct question, not a social one, and she answered it directly. Some days. Other days, it's just what I'm doing. He nodded. That was a real answer, and he received it as one, without the reflex to offer reassurance or minimize. He just nodded. What about the investor side, she said, steering them back to professional ground, which he understood was a deliberate choice and didn't take personally. Are you primarily London-based, or does the portfolio span London and Amsterdam are most active, Singapore is newer? He told her about the climate tech startup in Clerkenwell, left out the part about Ben Yao's resistance to organizational structures because it wasn't the kind of thing you aired at events, but conveyed the general shape of what interested him about early-stage investment. She asked a question about due diligence methodology and sustainability-adjacent companies. He told her his actual view, which wasn't entirely orthodox. She had a counterpoint. They went back and forth twice and landed somewhere neither of them had started. It was the kind of conversation that feels, when it's happening, like a door that's been left open rather than one you've had to push through. Not because there was no friction, there was, but because the friction was honest, and honest friction in conversation meant both people were actually present in it. David reappeared at Adrian's elbow with the apologetic expression of a host who has a social obligation to make. Adrian, there's someone I need to drag you to meet. Sorry, just 2 minutes. Adrian looked at Vivian. It was good to properly meet you. You too. David steered him away. Vivian stood at the window with her water glass and the quiet surprise of someone who arrived at a gathering expecting the ordinary texture of professional socializing and found something a degree or two different from that. She didn't name it. Naming things too quickly was a luxury she'd stopped affording herself. But she registered it. The specific quality of that conversation, the absence of performance on either side, the way he'd asked how the rest of her terrible day had gone and meant it as an actual question. She finished her water, said goodbye to David, retrieved her coat, and went back to Islington. Her mother was sitting in the nursing chair with Elena and the television on low, and she looked up when Vivian came in and said, "There's soup on the stove." And Vivian said, "Thank you," and meant it, and went to get a bowl. She did not think that evening about Adrian Cross in any sustained way. She had soup and talked to her mother for an hour and fed Elena and did a final email check and went to bed at 10:15 and was asleep within minutes. She was too busy for prolonged thinking about people she'd just met. She had, at this point in her life, made peace with the fact that there were only so many hours and some things had to wait. But in the morning, drinking coffee while Elena slept in the next room and the plane trees on the street below held the very first suggestion of buds, she found herself thinking about the question, how did the rest of that day go? And the way he'd asked it, like her answer mattered, like the day she'd been having was worth asking about. Small thing. She knew it was a small thing. But after 11 months of feeling largely invisible inside a life that was supposed to include her, small things were not as small as they used to be. Boots. In Mayfair, the small things had stopped being small in an entirely different way. Clarissa had come back from her sister's the morning after the divorce. She'd come back because she was not the kind of woman who ran from hard things, and because her sister's flat was lovely but small, and because the alternative to coming back was making a decision she wasn't ready to make. She came back, made coffee, sat across from Damien at the kitchen table and said, "I need you to tell me what you're planning to do about the baby." Not the baby, exactly. She'd said the baby, but what she meant was more complicated, and they both knew it. "I'm filing for legal recognition of paternity," Damien said. "Gerald's already started the preliminary work. And after that? After that, I pursue a custody arrangement." "Damien," she set down her mug. "She's 5 weeks old. The mother just went through a divorce alone. Custody is... That's not... She's my daughter." "I know that. I'm asking what you actually intend." He looked at her. "I intend to be in her life." "From what position?" Clarissa's voice was even. She was working very hard to keep it even. "Because right now you don't know her. You sat in a room with her for 2 hours and didn't hold her. I'm asking what being in her life looks like to you practically, not what it looks like in principle." Damien was quiet for a moment. He'd been quiet a lot in the past 18 hours, which was new. He was usually a man who filled silences, one way or another. "I don't know yet." "Then I need you to figure it out," Clarissa said. "Before you file anything, before you send attorneys after Vivian, figure out what you actually want, because right now it looks to me like what you want is to win something. And I don't think that's the same as wanting to be a father." He didn't answer that. He looked at the table. She could see him not answering it, the way you can see someone deciding that a particular truth is too uncomfortable to sit with right now, so they'll put it down and come back to it later. Clarissa picked up her mug. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I want to be clear about that. But I also need to be clear that I'm not going to pretend the last 24 hours haven't changed something. You have a daughter. That changes everything about what our life looks like from here, and I need us to actually talk about that. Not manage it, not get Gerald to handle it. Actually talk about it. Can you do that?" Damien looked at her. For once, he didn't have the easy answer ready. "Yeah," he said. "I can do that." She nodded. Got up to refill her coffee. The conversation was not finished. It was nowhere near finished. It would take weeks to really move through, and there would be worse moments in it than this one. But it had started, which was more than she'd been sure of the night before. In the days that followed, Gerald Fitch began the formal process of paternity establishment. Vivian's attorney, Sylvia Okafor, received the legal notice with the unsurprised efficiency of someone who had anticipated exactly this and had already begun preparing a response. She called Vivian, outlined the situation in the same brisk, undecorated terms she always used, and waited. Vivian was quiet for a moment on the phone. Elena was in the baby bouncer on the kitchen floor, watching the ceiling with the focused intensity she brought to everything. "He has the right," Vivian said. "I always knew he'd do this eventually." "He does," Sylvia agreed. "DNA testing will be ordered by the court. It's straightforward on the paternity side. What becomes complex is whatever follows: custody, access arrangements, visitation rights." "I know. I want to make sure we document everything from the start. Your sole caregiving since birth, the circumstances of the pregnancy. Your attempts to contact him during the letter, the voicemails. Exactly those." Sylvia's voice was calm. "He had his attorney file your letter, Vivian. His own attorney told us that. That kind of thing matters in a family court context." Vivian looked at Elena in the bouncer. She was waving one fist at nothing in particular with the conviction of someone who has decided that the air in front of her requires addressing. "Set it up," Vivian said. "Whatever needs to be done. I'm not running from this." "I know you're not." She hung up, sat at the table for a moment. Then she picked up Elena from the bouncer, held her against her chest, and stood at the kitchen window looking at the bare plane trees. The legal process was going to take months. It was going to be expensive in every sense of the word. She was going to have to walk back into rooms with Damien Ashcroft and his attorneys, and she was going to have to be exactly as steady as she'd been in that conference room, over and over, for however long it took. She could do that. She had done it once already with a 4-week-old in her arms and a divorce decree in her attorney's folder, and she had not flinched. But she was tired. She was genuinely bone-deep tired in the way that people get tired when they've been managing a hard situation alone for a long time, and the horizon keeps moving rather than getting closer. She didn't say this to anyone because there was no one to say it to who could actually do anything about it, and saying things that couldn't be helped wasn't her way. She said it eventually to Adrian. Not that evening was still weeks away. But eventually, in one of the conversations that slowly filled in the space between the David Cho networking event and something more substantial, she said it simply and plainly, the way you say things to people when you've stopped editing yourself for their comfort. And he listened without trying to solve it, and that alone was more useful than she could have expected. But that was later. Right now, she was standing at the kitchen window with Elena against her chest and the plane trees bare in the street below, and she was counting what she had. A small flat that was hers, a daughter who was healthy, work that was growing, an attorney who was formidable, the capacity, still intact, still functional, to keep moving through things that were hard. It wasn't nothing. In fact, when she counted it honestly, it was quite a lot. It was just heavier than she wished it was, and she was tired of carrying it without anyone to help hold the weight. She pressed her lips to the top of Elena's head. The baby smell, warm and close, the same thing that had loosened something in her chest the day of the divorce. "We're doing fine," she said quietly. "Both of us." Elena made a small sound against her collarbone, something between a sigh and an acknowledgement, and Vivian almost laughed. "I know," she said. "I know." Outside, the plane trees held their bare branches against the gray London sky. And in the distance, the city turned around them, indifferent and enormous, and full of the ordinary machinery of other people's lives. Other people who were also carrying things, also tired, also building something forward out of the material of what they had. Vivian didn't find that comforting, exactly. She was too practical for that kind of abstraction. But she found it true, and truth was generally what she reached for when comfort wasn't available. She went to start dinner. There was work to finish tonight after Elena went down, and Miriam was coming in the morning, and she had a call with the Bristol client at 9. She had, in other words, a life. Not the life she'd planned at 34 in a restaurant in Notting Hill, but hers. Entirely, clearly, undeniably hers. That was where she was starting from. It wasn't the worst place to begin. The DNA results came back on a Wednesday in late April, 11 weeks after the divorce was finalized, and they confirmed what everyone in every room had already known since the morning Vivian walked into the Whitmore and Hale conference room with a 4-week-old against her chest. Damien Ashcroft was Elena's biological father. Paternity, 99.998%. Gerald Fitch called him at 8:40 in the morning with the results, and Damien said very little, just write and send the documentation to my email, and hung up. He stood in the kitchen of the Mayfair flat in his running clothes. He'd been running more in the past 2 months, not for fitness exactly, more because the movement helped him think, or helped him avoid thinking, depending on the morning, and looked at the results on his phone screen for a long moment. He didn't know what he'd expected to feel. Relief, maybe, at having the thing confirmed in the clean language of science, or some sense of footing returned. What he actually felt was something more complicated and less satisfying, a kind of weight that the confirmation didn't lift so much as make official. He had a daughter. He had known it since February. Now the court knew it too. Clarissa was already at work. She'd started earlier hours in the past month, partly because of a large project that was consuming her studio, and partly, Damien suspected, because the earlier start gave her a structured reason to be somewhere other than the flat while the legal proceedings ground forward. They were still together. That was the honest way to put it. Still together, with an asterisk that neither of them spoke aloud. She'd stopped asking him what he felt about Vivian, which he appreciated, and he'd stopped expecting her to be unaffected by all of it, which was the least he could do. They had reached a kind of working equilibrium. It wasn't what either of them would have designed from scratch. It was what they had. Gerald Fitch's next call came at 10:15. Sylvia Okafor's office is requesting a meeting to discuss the framework for any future access arrangements before we proceed to formal custody filing, he said. They're proposing to do this out of court initially, a mediated discussion. Damien had his jacket on by then, standing at the window. That's Vivian trying to control the process. It's Vivian trying to avoid a prolonged court proceeding that would be expensive, stressful, and public for everyone involved, including the child, Gerald said, in the mild, precise way he delivered information he expected to be received badly. I would suggest it's worth considering on its merits. What are the merits? The merits are that family court judges look favorably on parents who demonstrate a willingness to cooperate, and less favorably on those who seem primarily interested in winning. There was a pause. You're saying that directly. I've been in this business for 30 years. I say things directly when they need to be said. Gerald shifted papers on his end. The mediation meeting doesn't preclude formal proceedings later if an agreement can't be reached, but it gives you an opportunity to establish your intentions in a setting that is somewhat less adversarial than a courtroom. When are they proposing? 2 weeks from Thursday. Damien looked out the window at the street below. A woman was walking a dog. 2 men were carrying something large between them. A sofa, he thought. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning. Fine, he said. Set it up. He put the phone down and stood at the window for a while longer. He'd been doing a lot of standing at windows lately. He recognized this as not especially productive, but found himself unable to stop doing it. He thought about Elena. He did this more than he admitted to anyone. Clarissa, Gerald, anyone. Thought about her in the specific and uncomfortable way you think about something you want and don't have the right to reach for directly. She was 3 months old now. She had his hands, Vivian had said that in the doorway with her back half turned, and he'd been carrying that sentence for 11 weeks, turning it over like something he'd found and couldn't identify. He hadn't seen her since the conference room, hadn't held her then, hadn't touched her, 3 feet away for 2 hours and 40 minutes, and he'd sat there with his 1,200-pound suit and his corporate attorney and let the time pass without doing the one thing he could have done, which was ask. He thought about asking now, whether it was even possible to ask, whether Vivian would allow it before the legal framework existed to require her to. He thought about calling Sylvia Okafor's office and making the request directly, without Gerald, just picking up the phone and saying, I'd like to meet her properly, before any of the rest of this starts. I know I don't have the right to demand it. I'm asking. He didn't make the call. He wasn't sure why. Partly because Gerald would advise against it, and Gerald's advice had been sound so far. Partly because he didn't trust himself to do it without it becoming something else. Without the asking becoming a negotiation. The vulnerability becoming leverage, which was how his instincts operated, and he knew it. And partly because there was a version of the call where Vivian said no, and he didn't know how to sit with that answer yet. So he put on his jacket and went to the office, and the morning moved on without him doing the harder thing. The mediation meeting was held in a neutral office in Holborn, a firm that specialized in family law dispute resolution and had the decor of a place that had been deliberately designed to feel less like a legal proceeding and more like a very serious interior design showroom. Pale wood, soft lighting, a round table rather than a rectangular one, which Damien recognized as a deliberate choice and found slightly irritating in its transparency. Sylvia Okafor arrived with Vivian at 2 in the afternoon. Vivian was alone this time. No baby, no assistant. She'd left Elena with the childminder she'd found in March, a woman named Greta who was 54 and had the calm, unflappable competence of someone who had spent 3 decades caring for other people's children and had no illusions about what the work actually involved. Vivian had vetted her for 6 weeks before leaving Elena for more than an hour, which was exactly the kind of process Vivian ran, and Greta had passed every part of it without knowing she was being assessed. She looked different without the baby. steadier in a specific way. Not that she'd been unsteady in February, but the absence of Elena meant the absence of the split-focus quality that new parenthood imposed on everything. She was fully present in the room in a way that Damien registered immediately as a tactical fact and a personal one. She looked at him when she came in, not the cool professional non-look she'd managed in February. Just looked, the way you look at someone you've been thinking about in complicated ways for months and are now in the same room with again. He looked back. The mediator was a woman named Dr. Carol Ashford, who was somewhere in her late 50s, compact and unhurried, with reading glasses she used as a thinking prop more than a vision aid. She opened with the standard framing. This was a facilitated conversation, not a legal proceeding. No decisions made here would be binding. The goal was to identify points of agreement before any formal process, and so on. Damien had heard versions of this preamble in other contexts. He waited it out. "I'd like to start," Sylvia said when Dr. Ashford finished, "by acknowledging where we are. My client carried a pregnancy alone, delivered without the father present, and has provided sole care for a child now 3 months old. The father was made aware of the pregnancy during that period and did not respond. I don't raise this to assign blame in this room. That's not why we're here. I raise it because it's the factual foundation of where the parental relationship currently stands, and any discussion of future arrangements needs to begin from an honest accounting of that foundation." Gerald Fitch shifted slightly. Damien kept his expression neutral. "My client accepts that account," Gerald said. Sylvia looked at Damien directly, which was slightly unusual. Attorneys in these settings generally directed themselves to each other or to the mediator. "Does your client accept it in his own words?" Dr. Ashford didn't intervene. She let the question sit. Damien looked at Vivian, who was watching him with the expression she'd had in the conference room, not hostile, not anticipating anything, just waiting to see what he would do with a moment that required something real. "Yes," he said. "I was aware she was trying to contact me. I had my attorney route her correspondence to a file. I didn't respond." He paused. "That was wrong. I know that." Vivian looked at him for a moment after he said it. Then she looked at her hands on the table. "Thank you," she said. Quietly, without particular warmth, but without cold either. Just acknowledgement. It was the first thing she'd said to him since February, and it was exactly 2 words. And it cost her something to say them, and he could see that it did, which made it land heavier than the most elaborate speech would have. Dr. Ashford leaned forward slightly. "With that acknowledged, what would both of you like the relationship between Elena and her father to look like, ideally? And I'm asking both of you, not your attorneys, in your own words. What does good look like for her?" Vivian answered first. "Elena knowing who her father is, in an age-appropriate way, at a pace she can manage. Consistency. If there's a schedule, it's kept. No using her as a communication channel between her parents. No," she stopped, considered. "No making her feel like she has to choose. Children shouldn't be made to carry that." Damien was quiet for a moment after she finished. "I want to know her," he said. "That's—" He stopped. Tried again, because the first version had sounded more like a mission statement than an honest sentence. "I sat 3 feet from her in February and didn't pick her up. I've thought about that every day since. I want the chance to not make that the whole story of who I am to her." Something moved through Vivian's face. Not forgiveness, that was too large a word for it, and too fast. More like she was acknowledging that he'd said something true, and she was doing him the courtesy of receiving it as such. "Then start small," she said. "That's what I'm asking. You don't walk into her life at 3 months and try to be immediately relevant. You start small. You show up when you say you will. You don't cancel. You don't let her get attached to a version of you that disappears when something more convenient comes along." "That's fair." "I know it is." Gerald Fitch cleared his throat. "We'd propose supervised visitation to begin, 2 hours weekly at a neutral venue with a review at 60 days. "Unsupervised," Damien said. "Damien?" Gerald started. "She's my daughter. I'm not going to sit in a room with a social worker while I meet my own child." Vivian looked at him steadily. "She's 3 months old and you're a stranger to her. Supervised doesn't mean we think you're dangerous. It means she's an infant, and infants need consistency, and someone familiar nearby while they're getting used to someone new. It's not punitive, it's developmental. It feels punitive. I know it does. She said it simply, without the edge he was waiting for. A lot of things that are necessary feel punitive. That doesn't mean they're wrong. He held her gaze. She held his. 8 weeks, he said. Supervised for 8 weeks. Then we review. Sylvia and Gerald looked at their respective clients. Dr. Ashford made a small note on her pad. 8 weeks, Vivian said. Then we discuss again. It wasn't an agreement in the legal sense. It was two people in a pale wood room acknowledging that they were going to have to build something difficult together over a long time, and that it was going to require them to be better than the history between them would naturally incline them to be. It was a beginning. Not a good one, not a clean one, a real one. On the way out, Damien stopped at the entrance while Sylvia was talking to someone from the mediation firm, and Vivian was putting on her coat. He stood about 6 feet from her, not approaching. "When can I see her?" he said. Just that. Not when will the first session be scheduled or have Gerald contact you. Just the question underneath all the process. Vivian finished buttoning her coat. "I'll talk to Sylvia about setting up the first session for next week." She picked up her bag. "She's a good baby, Damien. She's easy and she's strong and she smiles now. I want you to know that before you meet her properly. She's not suffering from not knowing you. She's doing well." She looked at him one more time. "I'm telling you that so you come into this the right way. Not to make you feel better, so you understand that she's fine and she needs you to stay fine." She walked out. He stood in the entrance of a family mediation center in Holborn and watched her go, and thought that he had been a very specific kind of fool, and that understanding exactly what kind doesn't always come with a clear path forward. But it was, at least, understanding. He hadn't had that 2 months ago. He was working with what he could get. Adrian had never intended to pursue it. That was the honest account, and he was someone who valued honesty in his own internal narration even when it wasn't comfortable. After the David Cho event in March, he'd thought about Vivian Hale in the background way you think about people who made an impression. Not obsessively, not with any plan, just occasionally. The conversation had been good. She was clearly smart and direct in doing something hard with a great deal of composure, and without making a performance of the composure, which was a specific thing he found himself respecting. He'd had his assistant look up her consulting practice. Not in a searching way, he'd been curious about the work she'd described, had genuinely wondered if there was overlap with some of the sustainability investments he was looking at, and he'd spent 20 minutes on her firm's website reading her project history before closing the tab and going back to the Graham investor problem, which still hadn't been fully resolved. He told himself this was professional interest. It was also, and he knew it, personal interest operating through a professional frame, which was a thing he recognized in himself when he was being honest. He ran into her again in May, by actual coincidence this time, in the coffee queue at a sustainability conference in South Kensington, where they'd both apparently registered independently and neither of them had known the other would be there. She came around a corner carrying a name badge she hadn't fully clipped on yet, and nearly walked directly into him, and they both stopped. And there was a moment of mutual recognition that had an involuntary quality, the slight recalibration of finding someone in an unexpected context. "You're here too," she said, redundantly, and they both knew it. Apparently. He looked at the badge in her hand. "Do you want help with that? The clip on those is, if you say it's like a car seat mechanism, I will walk in the other direction." He laughed. A real one, quick and genuine, and she looked briefly surprised. Then something lightened in her expression, not quite a smile, but adjacent to it. "Not a car seat," he said. "I was going to say it's unnecessarily complicated for what it is." "That's accurate?" She clipped it on, looked up. "Are you here for the morning sessions or the whole day?" "Whole day." "You?" "Morning. I have to be back for Elena by 2. They got their coffee together, the queue had merged them into a natural unit, and found 2 chairs on the side of the room where the first panel was setting up. Vivian checked the program. Adrian drank his coffee. The room filled around them. "Your climate tech startup," she said, looking at the program rather than him, which he'd come to understand was the way she processed conversation she was actually interested in. She looked at other things while she was thinking. Ben Yao's company, is that the Clearline project in Clerkenwell? He looked at her. How do you know about Clearline? I looked you up after David's event, professionally, she added, precisely. I was curious about the investment side. I looked up your firm, he said, after the same event, professionally. A pause. So we both did that, she said. We both did that. She looked up from the program. There was something in her expression that was very close to amusement, maybe not quite, but in the neighborhood. The Clearline project is connected to a supply chain accountability initiative I consulted on for a firm in Bristol 2 years ago. Different entry point, but overlapping methodology. I didn't know that. No, you wouldn't. My involvement was at the procurement stage, before the technology component was added. She turned back to the program. I think the morning session on infrastructure financing is going to be more useful than the roundtable. The roundtable panel is too broad. I had the same read. The conference moved around them, and they sat through the infrastructure financing session together. And twice she made a note in her conference booklet, and once he borrowed her pen when his ran out, which she handed over without comment, and he returned immediately. And when the session broke for lunch, she said, There's a reasonable Italian place 2 streets over that won't be as crowded as whatever they're doing in there. And he said, Lead the way. And that was how they had lunch, just the 2 of them, at a corner table in a restaurant in South Kensington on a Wednesday in May with the spring light coming through the window. The conversation moved from the conference to the Clearline methodology, to the Bristol project, to the general shape of the work they both did and why, and at some point it moved, naturally, and without either of them engineering it, into more personal territory. Not dramatically, there was no single pivot point, just the gradual adjustment that happens when 2 people are genuinely talking rather than presenting. The legal situation, she said, at one point, not prefaced with anything, just placed in the conversation like a fact she was setting on the table. With Elena's father, it started moving. Mediation? Last week, DNA is confirmed, which everyone already knew. Now we're figuring out access. She looked at her food. He wants to be involved. I believe he means it. I also don't fully trust his instincts yet. What do you mean? She considered. He's someone who has spent his whole life in a position where wanting something was most of what was required to get it. He wants to be her father. That's real. But wanting to be something and knowing how to be it are very different. I don't know yet which one he's operating from. And you can't know yet. No, not for a while. She pushed her fork through something on her plate. I just need him to not disappoint her. Whatever he does or doesn't do with me, with the history, I can manage that. I don't need anything from him, but she's going to need things from him eventually, and I can't protect her from it if he's inconsistent. I can only try to build in some structure that makes it harder for him to be. Adrian was quiet for a moment. That's a very specific fear. She looked at him. Do you think it's unfounded? No, I think it's exactly right. I think you're describing what happens when someone has to become something they've never had to practice being. He paused. It doesn't mean he can't get there. It means it'll take longer than he thinks and require more from him than he's currently expecting. Vivian looked at him for a moment. You said that like you know something about it. I've watched it happen with people I've worked with, and I've seen it from the inside once or twice. He didn't expand on that, and she didn't ask him to. It's not impossible, but you're right not to trust the wanting alone. She nodded. They let the subject rest. Later, walking back toward the conference building, they passed a patisserie with something displayed in the window that caught her eye. A very precise and elaborate tart. And she slowed slightly without stopping, a 2-second pause that she probably didn't notice herself. He noticed it. Do you want to go in? He said. I don't have time. I wasn't asking about time. She glanced at him. I don't need a tart. No. Do you want one? A beet. Yes. They went in. She got the tart, blood orange, on a pastry base so thin it looked structural rather than edible, and they stood on the pavement and she ate it out of a small paper bag with the focused, unself-conscious pleasure of someone who has been very disciplined for a long time and is briefly, consciously not being. It was not a significant moment. It was a person eating a pastry on a Tuesday in South Kensington. Adrian watched her and thought that she was one of the more interesting people he'd met in a long time, and that this was not uncomplicated, and that he was going to have to decide at some point whether to do anything about it. "That was worth it," she said, folding the paper bag. "Things usually are," he said. She looked at him with the slight narrowing she'd used in the conference room, the attention calibration, the checking of what she was actually looking at. Then she looked back at the street. "I have to get back to the afternoon session." "So do I." They walked back together. Not talking particularly, just walking, which was its own kind of ease. The first supervised visitation between Damien and Elena took place on a Thursday afternoon at a children's family center in Camden, a light-filled room with soft mats on the floor and toys arranged in low baskets, and a family support worker named Janet, who sat in the corner with a clipboard and the practiced neutrality of someone who had witnessed several hundred first meetings between parents and children and knew how to be present without being intrusive. Vivian brought Elena in a car seat this time. A different car seat, slightly newer model, and Damien noticed this detail in the way you notice things when you're nervous, and your attention is casting around for something manageable to land on. She handed the car seat to Janet and unclipped Elena and stood her up against her chest. Elena was 3.5 months old. She was larger than she'd been in February in the way that babies of that age are dramatically, surprisingly larger than they were a month before. Her face had changed, filled out, found its own particular shape. She had dark eyes that were probably going to stay dark, Vivian's coloring. But around the mouth and in the set of the jaw, there was something that was unambiguously Ashcroft, which was a strange thing to see in a face that small and new. She was looking at the room with the wide-focused attention of an infant encountering a new space, not distressed, just taking inventory. Damien stood about 5 feet away. He'd dressed down deliberately, no suit, just dark trousers and a plain shirt, as if the absence of armor would communicate something. He wasn't sure it would. He felt more exposed without the suit than he'd expected to. "Okay," Vivian said, to Elena primarily. "We're here." Then she looked at Damien. "She's just eaten, so she's in a good window. If she starts getting fussy, it usually means she's tired. She likes movement. If you pick her up and walk, that helps." "Right. You can come closer." He moved forward. Elena's gaze tracked to him with the general, non-specific attention of someone looking at a new object in a room. He crouched down slightly to her level, an instinct. He wasn't sure where it came from. "Hi," he said, quietly, feeling slightly ridiculous. Elena looked at him, the dark eyes, serious and unfocused and completely without judgment. "Hi," he said again. She made a sound. Not a response exactly. Infants of 3 months don't respond to words in the conversational sense, but a sound, a small, expressive noise that might have been anything, that might have been nothing, but that he felt in the middle of his chest like something physical. "Can I?" He looked at Vivian. "Yes." She stepped forward and transferred Elena into his arms before he'd fully finished the question, which was maybe deliberate, preventing him from overthinking it, removing the gap between asking and doing. Elena was heavier than he expected. That was always what people said. He'd heard it, but the reality of it was different from the description. The specific warm weight of her, the way she didn't know what to do with her head and moved it toward his shoulder with the tentative, searching quality of someone finding a perch. He put his hand on her back the way he'd watched Vivian do it in the conference room, the flat, steadying pressure. Elena looked at him from this new height with the same serious inventory-taking attention. She was trying to figure out what he was. He was trying to figure out the same thing about himself. "Hello," he said, for the third time. He felt the utter inadequacy of language in this moment, and was grateful that she didn't require it. He walked with her, the way Vivian had said, slow, even pacing around the soft mats. Elena's head settled against his shoulder. She didn't fuss. After about 3 minutes, she made the small, particular sound that Vivian had learned to read as the approach of sleep, and her eyes started their slow blink. Damien kept walking. He didn't look at Vivian. He didn't look at Janet with her clipboard. He looked at the window, at the afternoon light coming through it, at nothing. His daughter fell asleep against his shoulder in a children's center in Camden, and he held the weight of her and kept walking, and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say, and understood, fully, finally, without the buffer of distance or the softening of legal language, what he had almost lost without ever knowing he had it. Vivian watched from across the room. She watched him walk and watched Elena's eyes close and watched the careful way he adjusted his arm to support her better, the unconscious improvement in his hold, the thing that happened in his face when the baby actually settled. She felt something. She acknowledged the something and then set it aside, because whatever it was not the point. The point was Elena, asleep on a shoulder she didn't know yet but had accepted without protest, which was what infants did. They trusted the warmth before they knew the person, and you had to hope, not for your own sake but for theirs, that the warmth would prove to be something real. She hoped. That was all she could do. Across the city, in his office in Shoreditch, Adrian Cross was on the phone with the Graham investor problem, which had finally come to a head in the way that deferred problems do when you stop deferring them. He was not thinking about Vivian Hale. He was thinking about leverage ratios and contract language, and the specific stubbornness of a man who confused having capital with being right. But on his desk, next to the contract printout, was a small paper bag from a patisserie in South Kensington that he hadn't thrown away. He hadn't noticed it was still there until this moment. He looked at it for a second, then looked back at the contract. The Graham problem needed his full attention, but the paper bag stayed on the desk. The first 8 weeks of visitation proceeded without incident, which was not the same as proceeding smoothly, but was its own kind of progress. Damien showed up. He showed up every Thursday without canceling, without sending a substitute, without being late more than once. A traffic situation that he called ahead about from the car, which Vivian logged without comment. He was not immediately good at it. He was awkward in the first 3 sessions in the specific way of a man who has spent 20 years being competent at everything he chose to invest in and is now encountering something that doesn't respond to competence. Elena didn't perform for him. She didn't ease the awkwardness or reward his efforts with smiles on schedule. She was herself, a baby, with a baby's needs and rhythms and total indifference to anyone's emotional investment in the outcome of any given hour. Some weeks she was agreeable. Some weeks she was fussy and wanted Vivian and communicated this with the full force of her developing lungs. Damien managed it. Not gracefully, but he managed it, and he didn't make it about himself, which Vivian watched for and found, somewhat to her surprise, that he passed. Janet wrote up her reports with the even-handed neutrality of a professional, noting consistent attendance, appropriate responsiveness, no cause for concern. By the end of the 8 weeks, something had shifted. Small, not dramatic, but real. At the review meeting with Sylvia and Gerald, Vivian sat across the table from Damien and said, "I'm willing to move to unsupervised, 2 hours on Thursdays at a venue we agree on for the next 3 months. Then we review again." Damien looked at her. He looked like he wanted to say something that wasn't just the legal acceptance, and she waited to see if he would. "Thank you," he said. I know what that costs you." She held his gaze for a moment. "Don't make me regret it," she said. Not harshly, just honestly, the same way she said most things. "I won't." She believed him. Not completely, not yet. Complete belief was something you built out of evidence over time, not a thing you granted in a meeting room, but enough. Enough to take the next step. That was the only way any of it moved. One step, provisionally, after the last. Outside the meeting room, while Gerald and Sylvia were exchanging documents, Damien and Vivian stood in the hallway with the particular discomfort of 2 people who have just done something real together and don't quite know how to stand in the aftermath of it. "She said something last week," Damien said. "I know it's probably just, she's at the age where they start doing it, I know, but she made a sound when I came in, before I spoke, like she recognized the—" He stopped. "I don't know what she recognized. Probably nothing." Vivian looked at him. "She recognizes your voice," she said. "I've been playing a recording of you talking from a video online." I thought she should start having something before the visits. She paused. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to become a thing. I just thought it was the right thing to do for her. He stood in the hallway of a law office in Holborn and looked at the woman he had left, the woman who had carried his child alone and signed divorce papers with his name on them, and then, quietly, without telling anyone, played his voice to his daughter so the sound of him would be less foreign when he finally arrived. He didn't say anything. He wasn't capable, in that moment, of saying anything that was adequate. I should get back, Vivian said. She picked up her bag. Greta has Elena until 4. She walked to the elevator. He stayed in the hallway. The elevator door closed. He stood there for a long moment, and the hallway was very quiet. And somewhere in the city, a 3.5-month-old named Elena was with a childminder who smelled familiar and a voice that she knew from a recording her mother had thought to play. And the architecture of what Vivian Hale was, the specific texture of what she was made of, settled over him like something he had no name for and no right to claim. He walked back into the meeting room. Gerald looked up. Ready to finish the paperwork? Yes, Damien said. Let's finish it. His voice was steady. His hands were not, quite. But he put them in his pockets and nobody noticed, and the afternoon moved on and the world kept turning. And somewhere across the city, the woman he had discarded without knowing what he was discarding was putting on her coat and going to collect their daughter and going home. And she was going to be fine. And the fine was something she had built herself, and no court document and no legal arrangement was going to give him any part of the credit for it. He knew that. He was at last beginning to fully know that. Summer came to London the way it sometimes did, tentatively at first, a week of warmth in June that people didn't trust, and then suddenly, fully, the plane trees outside Vivian's flat, thick and green, and the evenings long enough that Elena's bedtime arrived while there was still light in the sky. Elena was 5 months old in June, then 6 in July, and the changes that happened in those 2 months were the kind that made Vivian understand why people said it went fast, because it did go fast, and also it didn't. It was simultaneously the longest and shortest period of her life, every day full to the edges and then suddenly gone. Elena sat up with assistance. She reached for things with focused, effortful intentionality. She had opinions about which toys were interesting and which were not, and she communicated these opinions clearly and without diplomacy. She laughed, a real laugh, not the reflexive social smile of early infancy, but a genuine full-body response to things she found funny, which included peekaboo, the sound of Greta's keys, and, inexplicably, a specific yellow sponge that had been in the bath since her first week home. The laugh was one of the things Vivian had not expected to be so completely undone by. She'd expected to love her daughter. She had not been prepared for how specifically funny and particular Elena would be, the way she was already becoming a person rather than just a baby, with preferences and reactions that were entirely her own. Damien saw this too, in the Thursday visits that had become unsupervised in May and had been quietly extended to 3 hours by mutual agreement in June. He didn't say much to Vivian about it at the brief handoffs. They kept those practical logistics only, Greta sometimes serving as the intermediary to reduce the friction of the transition. But Vivian could see it in him when he came back. He came back differently than he left. The guardedness he carried into every exchange with her, the careful positioning, the maintained distance, was slightly reduced after 3 hours with Elena. Not gone, just filed down at the edges. He'd bought her things. A soft elephant she immediately attached to, which she required for sleep with the absolute insistence of someone who has decided that a stuffed animal is non-negotiable. A set of stacking rings that she had not yet learned the developmental purpose of, but had identified as suitable for chewing. Vivian noted the purchases without comment. They were appropriate and not excessive, which she'd half expected they wouldn't be. She'd expected either undershoot or overcompensation, and instead he'd landed somewhere sensible, which surprised her, and she was honest enough to admit that it did. What she didn't see, because it didn't happen in front of her, was Damien in the first week of unsupervised visits, sitting in the small cafe near the Camden venue where he'd suggested they walk when the weather was good. Elena in the pushchair Vivian had sent with him, and Damien drinking a coffee he barely tasted and watching his daughter watch the pigeons with the same intensity she brought to everything. He didn't have his phone out. He didn't check his email. He just sat there while Elena watched the pigeons and made small sounds at them, and something in him that had been running at a constant elevated pitch for 11 years of building and acquiring and positioning started in those 3 hours to do something it very rarely did. It slowed down. He didn't tell Clarissa this in those terms. Clarissa and he had reached a kind of stable ground by summer that neither of them would call satisfying, but that both of them were choosing, for now. She'd moved back into the flat fully in March, and they'd had the difficult conversations she'd asked for, and what had emerged from those conversations was a relationship that was more honest than it had been before February, which was something, even if what it had exposed was a set of fault lines that hadn't been visible before. She knew about the elephant. She'd seen the receipt. She didn't comment, which was its own comment. He tried once to explain what was happening to him, not specifically about Elena, but the larger thing, the slowing down, the particular quality of the Thursday afternoons. "You look different on Thursdays," Clarissa said. They were in the kitchen, a Wednesday evening. "When you come back?" "Different how?" She looked at him from across the counter. "Like something's been turned off. In a good way." He thought about that. "She doesn't know I have any power over anything," he said finally. "She doesn't know about the company or the money, or she doesn't care. She just knows whether I'm warm and whether I show up." Clarissa was quiet for a moment. "That's what babies do." "I know." He looked at his hands on the counter. "I haven't had that in a long time. Someone who just cares about whether I show up." Clarissa looked at him for a long moment, and what was in her face was complicated. Not hurt exactly, not jealousy. Something older and harder to name. The acknowledgement, maybe, that what Damien had just described was something their relationship had stopped providing, or had never quite provided, or had provided only partially, and neither of them had noticed until a Thursday afternoon, with a 7-month-old in a pushchair, made the absence clear by contrast. She picked up her wine glass. "You should keep going," she said. "The visits. Whatever you need to work out, keep going." "I intend to." "I know." She drank, looked at the window. "I just wanted you to know I'm not fighting it." He didn't say thank you. It felt like the wrong response, too transactional for what she was offering. He stayed at the counter, and they let the evening move on. And he thought that she deserved more than this arrangement, and that he was not yet sure he was capable of giving it, and that the not yet sure was no longer something he could keep pretending was an answer. The custody hearing was scheduled for early September, 3 months after the unsupervised visits began, and it arrived not as a surprise, but as a deadline that concentrated everything that had been diffuse and ongoing into a single, formal reckoning. Damien's position had evolved considerably from what Gerald Fitch had originally outlined in April. The initial framework, substantial shared custody, alternating weeks once Elena was old enough, meaningful co-parenting equality, had been scaled back not because of legal pressure, but because Damien himself had revised it. 3 months of Thursdays had taught him things he couldn't have learned any other way. He was not, at this moment in Elena's life, the equal he'd initially claimed the right to be. He was someone she was getting used to, someone she'd learned to trust within a limited and consistent context. To expand that context too quickly, too ambitiously, before the trust was deep enough to hold it, he understood now what Vivian had meant about Elena's needs having their own timeline that was completely indifferent to what either parent wanted. He'd told Gerald this in August, and Gerald had received it with the equanimity of someone who has spent 30 years watching parents arrive at their children's reality on various schedules. "So what are you asking the court for?" Gerald said. "What I have: regularity, consistency, room to grow into it." That's a significant adjustment from April's proposal. "April's proposal was about me," Damien said. "This one's about her." Gerald wrote something down. "The court will notice that." "I know." Vivian's position had also evolved, though in a different direction. She was not fighting Damien's involvement. She hadn't been, not really, even when she had every legal and emotional justification to make it difficult. What she was fighting for was the framework, the structure, the guarantee that what Elena had come to rely on would be protected by something more durable than Damien's current good intentions. She'd seen what his intentions looked like in October when he'd had her letter filed without reading it. She needed the court to be the structure when his intentions were insufficient. "I want it documented," she told Sylvia, 2 weeks before the hearing. They were in Sylvia's office, Elena asleep in the carrier on Vivian's chest in the particular boneless way of a sleeping infant, arms dangling, completely surrendered to it. Not punitive, not restrictive. I want what works to be written down so that if something changes, if he gets distracted, if other things become more important, there's something that doesn't change. Sylvia nodded. "The judge will ask about your objections to expanded custody." "My objection is timing, not principle. She's 7 months old. She's bonded to me, to Greta, to a routine. Disrupting that because a biological connection entitles someone to equal weight in her life. That's not how children work. It's not how this child works. You'll need to say that clearly, in exactly those terms." "I know." Vivian shifted Elena's weight. "I've been saying things clearly for a long time. I'm not new at this." Sylvia almost smiled. "No, you're not." The hearing was before a judge named Honorable Patricia Whitlow, who had been hearing family court cases for 19 years and had, in that time, developed the ability to read a room with the economy of someone who has heard every version of every argument and knows within 4 minutes which people are performing for the court and which ones are talking about their actual children. She had read both parties' submissions, the supervised visitation reports from Janet, the character assessments, the financial disclosures, the timeline of the pregnancy, and Vivian's attempts to contact Damien and the fate of those attempts. She had read all of it. You could tell, from the way she looked at the room when she entered, that she had read all of it and had already formed a provisional view that the proceedings were going to either confirm or challenge. Damien sat at his side of the courtroom in a suit he'd chosen carefully. Not the Milan one, not the aggressive armor of the divorce proceeding. Something quieter. He looked like himself, which was maybe the point, or maybe it was just what he looked like now after 7 months of Thursdays and the particular kind of undoing that showed up on a person's face when they've started paying attention to something outside themselves for the first time in a long while. Vivian sat at her side without the baby, Greta had Elena, and looked at the room the way she always looked at rooms, with the peripheral, comprehensive awareness of someone who knows that what matters is usually not in the center. Gerald Fitch presented Damien's revised position first. The judge listened without expression. Sylvia presented Vivian's position second, methodically and without theater. The timeline of the pregnancy, the voicemails, the letter routed to a file, the birth, attended by Vivian's mother and no one else, the 4 weeks of sole care before the divorce proceeding, the mediation meeting in April, the supervised visits, the consistent attendance, the transition to unsupervised, the current arrangement and why it was working, and why working was not a reason to disrupt it, but a reason to protect it. Judge Whitlow listened to all of it. She asked 3 questions during Gerald's presentation and 5 during Sylvia's, and the questions were the kind that had no good answer except the honest one, which was itself information. Then she asked to hear from the parties directly. Damien spoke first. He'd prepared something with Gerald, a statement structured and carefully worded, and then the night before he'd put it down and thought about what he actually wanted to say, which was different. He stood in the courtroom and said, "I made choices during the pregnancy that I can't undo. I didn't know about Elena because I made it impossible for myself to know. I'm not asking the court to weigh my intentions against my actions. I'm asking to continue what's been established over the past 5 months, which is a relationship with my daughter built on her terms, at her pace. I'm not looking for equal custody. I'm looking for the right to keep showing up." Judge Whitlow looked at him for a moment after he sat down. Then she looked at Vivian. Vivian stood. She didn't have notes. "Elena is 7 months old," she said. "She has a routine that she trusts and people she knows and a security that I've spent 7 months building around her specifically because she came into the world in circumstances that were already unstable. I'm not here to punish her father for the past. I'm here to make sure that whatever is decided today puts her needs first, not his guilt, not my anger, not what either of us feel we deserve. What she deserves is consistency. Whatever this court decides, I'm asking that it be structured around her reality, not around what either of her parents wish the situation were." She sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Judge Whitlow made a note, looked at both sides. "I'll take a recess," she said. 30 minutes? The corridor outside the courtroom had the specific institutional quiet of a building full of consequential things happening behind closed doors. Vivian sat on a bench with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and checked her phone for a message from Greta. Elena had been a little fussy that morning, probably a tooth starting, and Vivian had been tracking it with one part of her attention all day. The message said, "All fine, she's asleep, stop checking your phone." Vivian almost smiled. Damien was at the end of the corridor, standing by the window, not looking at his phone. He had his hands in his pockets and was looking at the street below in the way he'd been looking at streets below windows for months. That particular posture of a man who is somewhere between where he was and where he's trying to get to. She didn't go to him. They didn't speak. There wasn't anything useful to say in a courthouse corridor 30 minutes before a judge came back with a decision about their daughter's life. Gerald Fitch went to get coffee. Sylvia made a phone call. The corridor breathed quietly around them. What Vivian thought about, sitting on that bench, was not the hearing or the judge or the legal framework. She thought about Elena that morning, getting dressed, the way Elena had grabbed her own sock and held it with fierce, purposeful concentration, examining it as if it contained information, and then looked up at Vivian with the expression she had that meant, "I have found a thing and I am reporting it to you." And Vivian had said, "I see it. Yes, that's your sock," with the kind of earnest engagement you bring to the communication of a 7-month-old, because it is, in fact, earnest. And Elena had made the satisfied sound she made when she felt received. That was what she was protecting. Not a legal arrangement, not a custody percentage. That. The sock and the look and the response and the feeling, on both sides of it, of being understood. She would protect it with whatever the court gave her today. She would protect it with whatever she had. Judge Whitlow returned in 27 minutes, which was 3 minutes early, which told both legal teams nothing useful, but which they both tried to read anyway. She settled herself, looked at her notes, looked at the room. "This is not a complicated case in the legal sense," she said, "though it is a serious one. The facts are clear. The child is healthy and securely attached to her primary caregiver. The father's absence during the pregnancy was a choice, however enabled by circumstance. His subsequent engagement has been consistent and appropriate. The current arrangement is functional." She paused. "The question before me is how to protect what is working while providing a framework for what needs to grow." She looked at her notes once more. Then she delivered the ruling. Full custody to Vivian's. Primary residence, primary decision-making on education, healthcare, all significant matters. Damien. Regular unsupervised visitation, the Thursday arrangement formalized and extended to include 1 weekend day per fortnight beginning when Elena turned 12 months, with a scheduled review at 18 months to assess expansion. No alternating weeks, no 50-50 split. A defined, protected structure with room built in for the relationship to develop at a pace the child could absorb. She addressed Damien directly at the end. "Mr. Ashcroft, the record shows that you have used the past 5 months well. I want to acknowledge that. But I also want to be clear about what this order reflects. It reflects where you are, not where you were. It is not a ceiling. A child's relationship with her father matters, and the court takes that seriously. What you do with the access you've been granted will determine what comes next. That is entirely in your hands." She closed her folder. "We're adjourned." That scene. Outside the courthouse, in the same September air where 8 months earlier, Vivian had stood on a different pavement and exhaled and said, "Okay," to the gray London morning. Sylvia walked beside her toward the car. "That was the right outcome," Sylvia said. "I know." "How do you feel?" Vivian thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said, "and relieved, in that order." Sylvia nodded. Both appropriate. She squeezed Vivian's arm briefly, a rare gesture from a woman not given to physical reassurance, and went to deal with paperwork. Vivian stood on the pavement. She called Greta. "How is she?" "Awake, chewing the elephant. I think the tooth is coming through properly now. She's not as fussy." A pause. "How did it go?" "Well," Vivian said. "It went well." She hung up, stood for a moment in the September light, which was the particular gold of early autumn, low and long-shadowed. She thought about calling. Claude's response was interrupted. She thought about calling Adrian. That was what she'd been about to think, standing on the pavement outside the courthouse in the September gold, before the thought completed itself and she'd hung up with Greta and put the phone in her bag. She thought about calling Adrian, and then she thought about what that meant, that he was the person she wanted to tell first, before her mother, before Miriam, before anyone who had been with her through the long, difficult architecture of the past 8 months. That was information. She filed it. She'd known by then that what was between them was more than professional interest filtered through mutual acquaintance and shared coffee at a conference in South Kensington. She'd known it for a while. She was not someone who misread her own interior landscape, whatever her other failures of perception, but knowing it and deciding what to do with it were different operations, and she'd been running them separately, carefully, the way you handle something you don't want to break by moving too quickly. They had seen each other 6 times between the May conference and the September hearing. Twice at events where both of them happened to be. Once when he'd called her directly to ask a professional question about supply chain methodology that was clearly a genuine question and was also clearly not the only reason for the call. She could hear both things simultaneously and had answered the professional question fully and then said, "Was there anything else?" And he'd paused and said, "Not at the moment," and she'd accepted that as an honest answer. Twice for what were technically working lunches that ran 2 hours past any reasonable definition of work. And once, in late July, when he'd come to Islington. That one had not been planned. He'd been nearby for a meeting that ran short, and he'd texted, "I'm in the area, if you have half an hour." She'd stared at the message for long enough that it became a decision, and then she'd said, "Come for tea," and he'd come. He'd met Elena that afternoon. She was 6 months old, sitting propped against the cushions on the floor with the yellow sponge from the bath in her hands, examining it with the focused attention she brought to objects she considered important. Adrian had sat on the floor without being asked to, just folded himself down to her level, which was the right instinct, the unself-conscious rightness of someone who is comfortable with children without performing that comfort. And Elena had looked at him for a long moment with her serious dark eyes and then held out the yellow sponge. "She's offering you the sponge," Vivian said from the kitchen doorway, where she was making tea and watching. "That's a significant gesture. She doesn't share that with most people." Adrian had taken the sponge with appropriate gravity. Elena had watched him hold it, apparently satisfied with how he was handling it, and then reached for it back. He returned it immediately. She tucked it against her chest and went back to examining it, the transaction complete. "I passed the test," he said. "You did." Vivian came in with the tea. "Don't read too much into it. She also gave it to Greta's umbrella last week." He'd laughed. Elena had looked up at the sound. She always looked up at laughter, tracking it with interest, and then made a sound back at him, her own version. And his face had done something that Vivian had looked away from because it was too direct, too clear. The thing in a person's face when they are unexpectedly moved by something small. They'd had tea. Elena had eventually needed a nap, and Vivian had put her down and come back, and they'd sat at the small table by the window and talked for another hour. And at some point, the talking had become the kind of quiet that wasn't empty. The kind where 2 people are in the same room, not saying anything, and the silence is comfortable, and that comfort is itself a thing that means something. He'd left at 6. At the door he'd stopped, and she'd thought he was going to say something that would move them into different territory, and she'd been both ready and not ready for that. The particular internal contradiction of wanting something and not being certain the timing was right. But he'd just said, "Good luck with the hearing," and touched her hand briefly, just a moment, his fingers against the back of her hand, something between a handshake and something else. And then he was gone. She'd stood in the doorway of her flat and thought very clearly, this is a person who knows how to wait. Not out of passivity, not because he lacked the nerve, but because he understood that some things could only be received when the other person was actually ready to receive them. He'd read that about her and he was honoring it, and she didn't know what to do with that quality in a person because she hadn't encountered it before in someone she was drawn to, and it scared her slightly, the way things that are good for you sometimes do when you've been living without them for long enough. So she'd filed it, along with everything else, and gone back inside, and focused on the hearing, and told herself there was an order to things, and the order mattered, and she would get to it when she got to it. Standing on the pavement outside the courthouse in the September light, she got out her phone. Didn't call her mother, didn't call Miriam. She texted Adrian. It went well. Full custody. She's with Greta. Going to get her now. The response came back in 4 minutes. Good. That's the right outcome. Give her the sponge from me. Vivienne looked at the message for a moment. Then she got in the car and went to get her daughter. She told him properly over dinner 3 weeks later at a restaurant in Clerkenwell that was neither expensive nor trying to be, the kind of place that had good food and enough noise that the conversation around them gave them cover without intruding. She told him about the hearing, about Judge Whitlow's direct address to Damien, about standing on the pavement afterward and the particular quality of the relief. He listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both about Elena rather than the legal outcome, which she noted. Then she told him the other thing, the thing she'd been filing since July. I need to be honest with you about where I am, she said, because I think you deserve that before anything else. Okay, he said, just that. I'm not. She stopped, started differently. I'm not someone who does things badly twice. I was in a marriage where I stopped being fully seen and I allowed it to happen gradually, and by the time I understood what had happened, it was already over. I'm not going to do that again, which means I'm slow. I'm careful. I ask more questions than is comfortable, and I trust incrementally, and I need things to be named rather than assumed. Those sound like reasonable requirements, he said. They're inconvenient. Most reasonable things are. He looked at her directly. What are you asking me? I'm not asking anything yet. I'm telling you what it looks like on my end, so you know what you're... She paused. So you know what this is, if it's something. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her the way he sometimes did. The full attention, the thing that she'd first noticed at the David Cho event, the quality of actually being looked at rather than observed. It's something, he said. It has been something since the conference room in February when you told that man the child was yours and didn't flinch. She looked at him. You weren't in that conference room. No, but David told me about it weeks before the event. He knew Sylvia Okafor professionally. He'd heard. He paused. I didn't connect it to the woman on the pavement until the event. But when I did connect it... He stopped, then continued honestly. I thought that was a person I wanted to know better. Vivienne sat with that for a moment. The restaurant moved around them. Someone dropped something in the kitchen, and there was a brief clatter, and then the ambient hum resumed. I have a daughter, she said. That's not a footnote. That's the whole text. I know that. And her father is going to be in our lives in a structured way, indefinitely. That's also not a footnote. I know that too. He leaned forward slightly. Vivienne, I sat on the floor of your flat and your daughter gave me a yellow sponge. I'm not confused about what I'm walking toward. She looked at him. The honesty in his face was the specific kind that doesn't have anything to prove, which was the only kind she trusted anymore. Okay, she said. Okay? Okay, she said again, and something in her that had been held very carefully for a very long time moved slightly, like a door not yet open but no longer fully closed. Clarissa left in October. Not dramatically. Not in the way of things that have been building to an explosion. She left in the way that honest endings sometimes happen, quietly, with clarity, with a mutual acknowledgement that the thing they'd been protecting wasn't the relationship itself but the idea of the relationship, and that those two things were no longer the same. She'd been doing her own accounting since February. The morning in the corridor after the divorce, the evening when Damien had described what Elena gave him, the uncomplicated wanting of a person who cared only whether he showed up, Clarissa had carried that sentence for months and known, in the private way that people know things before they're ready to say them out loud, that it was a sentence about something she and Damien had never quite managed to give each other. She packed efficiently. She was good at logistics. She took what was hers, left what was his, didn't make a scene about the things in between. I'm not angry, she told him. They were in the kitchen, which was where the important conversations in that flat always seemed to happen. I want you to know that. I came into this with my eyes open, or I thought I did. I think we both believed a version of this that wasn't quite accurate. Clarissa, I'm not looking for an apology. I'm telling you where I am. She set her keys on the counter, The flat keys, just the two of them, a small definitive sound. You're a different person than you were in February. I've watched it happen, and I'm glad for it, genuinely. But the person you're becoming isn't... She stopped, found the honest version. He's not becoming it for me. Damien didn't argue. He couldn't. The argument didn't exist. I'm sorry, he said, for what it cost you. All of it. I know you are. She picked up her bag, looked at him one more time with the directness of someone who has stopped managing another person's feelings and is speaking only from her own. Take care of that little girl, Damien. Actually take care of her. Not for the court, not to prove something, just for her. That's what I'm doing, he said. I believe you, she said. That's actually why I'm leaving. She walked out. He stood in the kitchen. The keys sat on the counter. He picked them up and held them for a moment and then set them down again, and the flat was very quiet. In the way flats are quiet when they've held two people for a year and one of them is suddenly gone. He did not call anyone. He sat at the kitchen table for a while and let it be what it was, which was an ending he had earned through a series of choices that had seemed, at each individual point, manageable, and had accumulated into something that was not. He thought about Elena. He always thought about Elena, in the background, the way you carry something warm in your coat pocket and feel its presence without having to look at it directly. Thursday was 4 days away. He would pick her up from Greta's, and they would go to the cafe with the pigeons, and she would be 8 months old now and pulling herself up on things. Vivian had mentioned grabbing table edges and chair legs and the front of anyone's shirt with the determined ambition of someone who has decided that vertical is the next frontier. She would grab his shirt and pull herself up and look at him with the startled pride of someone who has just discovered something astonishing about physics, and he would hold her steady so she didn't fall, which was, he understood now, the basic description of what a parent was. He held her steady so she didn't fall. It was not complicated in the end. It was just hard, and the hard was not something you could outsource or manage around or have Gerald Fitch handle. It was something you showed up for, Thursday after Thursday, coat pocket warm, pigeons on the pavement. He went to bed, slept better than he'd expected to. The year turned. Elena walked at 11 months, not gracefully, not with the smooth, confident stride of a baby who has fully committed, but with the specific wobbling determination of someone who has decided that walking is happening today, regardless of what her legs think about it. She walked from the coffee table to Vivian's outstretched hands across 3 feet of living room carpet, and then sat down hard and looked enormously pleased with herself. Vivian said, yes, exactly that. And Elena said something that was not quite a word and was clearly meant to be, and they stayed there on the floor for a long time, not doing anything else. Adrian was there for it. He was in the kitchen making tea when it happened and came to the doorway and watched the last 2 steps, and his expression was the same one he'd had in July with the yellow sponge. The thing in a person's face when they are quietly, unexpectedly moved, and Vivian looked at him over Elena's head, and something passed between them that didn't need language. They had not moved fast. They had moved at the pace that Vivian needed and that Adrian had the patience for, which was slower than either of them might have moved in a different season of their lives, and was entirely right for this one. He came to the flat on weekends when he wasn't traveling, and Elena had incorporated him into her understanding of the world with the uncomplicated acceptance of a child who categorizes people primarily by warmth and consistency, both of which he provided without making it a thing. He'd met Greta, who had sized him up in 3 minutes and pronounced him sensible, which from Greta was the highest available praise. He'd spoken once on the phone with Vivian's mother, Margaret, who'd called while Vivian was giving Elena a bath, and he'd answered because his hands weren't full, and Margaret had conducted what could only be described as a quiet, polite interrogation while Vivian's splashing sounds came from down the hall. And afterward, Margaret had said to Vivian, he didn't try to be charming, in a tone that indicated this was precisely what she'd needed to hear. He hadn't tried to be anything, which was, Vivian had come to understand, the truest thing about him. Damien met Adrian in January, at a handoff outside the Islington flat that happened to coincide with Adrian's car parked at the curb. There was no scene, there was no confrontation. There was a brief, direct exchange between two men who both understood what the situation was, and neither of whom had any interest in making it worse than it needed to be. Damien looked at Adrian for a moment with the specific look of a man taking an accounting of his own choices by looking at their consequences. Adrian looked back without performance. "She talks about you," Damien said. "About Elena, clearly." "I know," Adrian said. "She talks about you too." Damien nodded, got in his car, drove away. Adrian went upstairs. Vivian was in the kitchen and looked at him when he came in with the question she didn't ask. "Fine," he said. "It was fine." She nodded, handed him a cup of tea. He took it and stood at the window with the plane trees that were bare again now, cycling back through winter. And that was all. Nothing required. He proposed in March, a year, almost exactly, after the David Cho event. They were in the flat, a Sunday evening, Elena already asleep, dinner finished, the kind of ordinary evening that accumulates into a life without announcement. He didn't have a ring. He'd thought about the ring and decided that a ring without a conversation was the wrong order, that she would want the conversation first and the ring later, which was correct, and she appreciated it more than she could have explained. He said, "I know your requirements. I know they're not inconvenient. They're accurate. I know what I'm asking, and I know what it comes with, and I want it, all of it. I want you, and I want Elena, and I want Thursday handoffs and school schedules, and Greta's opinions, and your mother calling to make sure I'm eating vegetables. I'm not asking because I think you need me. I'm asking because I think we're better, both of us, in the direction of each other, and I think Elena deserves someone who is in it completely, not as a supporting role." Vivian looked at him for a long time. She did this. The long looks, the actual looking, the refusal to respond before she'd thought, and he waited because he always waited. "Yes," she said. "Not of course, or I thought you'd never ask, or any of the things that people say when they've been performing their way through a relationship and the performance has its own momentum. Just yes. Direct, decided, real." He exhaled, and she saw him do it. The breath he'd been holding without knowing it, which was the most honest thing she'd seen him do and which made her love him more than she already did, which was considerable. The adoption was finalized 18 months later, on a Tuesday in autumn, in a different court building from the one where the custody hearing had been held, with a different judge who had the cheerful matter-of-factness of someone who deals in good news rather than disputed ones. Elena was 2.5, old enough to be present without understanding the legal weight of what was happening, young enough that she would not remember it as a moment, but would grow up inside its fact. She sat on Vivian's lap during the brief proceeding and was interested primarily in the judge's pen, which was red and therefore significant, and when it was over and everyone signed and the clerk said, "Congratulations, that's official." Elena looked around the room with the alert, receptive attention she'd had since birth, that quality of taking inventory, of wanting to understand what a space meant, and then looked at Adrian beside her and held up her arms. He took her. She put her head on his shoulder in the way she'd had since she was 3 months old, and he'd first walked with her around a room in a children's center in Camden, the head settling, the trust that preceded understanding, the body's knowledge arriving before the mind's. Vivian watched this and did not look away. There are things that happen in a life that you don't have language for while they're happening. You only get the language later, sometimes years later, when you can look back at the shape of things and understand what the shape was made of. Standing in a small room in a court building in London, watching her daughter put her head on the shoulder of the man who had chosen them both, Vivian understood something she had been working toward for 2.5 years without fully knowing she was working toward it. That it was possible to build something real from a place of complete ruin. Not in spite of the hard parts, but partly because of them. Because the hard parts had burned off everything that wasn't true. And what remained was exactly what it claimed to be. A woman who knew what she could carry. A man who had learned what showing up actually meant. A child who trusted warmth before she understood it, and had been given warmth consistent enough to earn that trust. Damien had arrived at his own version of that understanding, more slowly, on a longer road, with more of the road still ahead of him. He was a different father at 2 years in than he'd been at the Camden Children's Center. Not an exceptional one. He was still learning, still occasionally getting the timing wrong, still sometimes defaulting to the reflex of a man whose first instinct was control, rather than patience. But he showed up. Every Thursday. Every scheduled Saturday. No cancellations, or almost none. And the ones that happened were called in advance with genuine apology rather than excuses. Elena called him by his first name because that was how she'd learned him, and she was at ease with him in the specific way of a child who has been given time to arrive at comfort at her own pace. He did not try to be what he hadn't been. That was the thing, in the end, that Vivian had not expected from him, that he would accept the shape of what was possible rather than fighting for the shape of what he'd imagined. That the man who had walked into a conference room in February expecting to win had quietly, without announcement, stopped trying to win something and started trying to do something instead. The difference between those two orientations was the whole story. It did not make him a hero. He was not one. He had done considerable damage, and the damage had its own permanent geography in several lives. But he was, at 2 years out, someone who had looked at the consequences of his choices and decided to build his remaining choices on something more honest than the ones that had come before. That was not redemption. That was just accountability, which is less dramatic but more durable. Vivian never told him about the recordings, the voice recordings she'd played for Elena during the pregnancy. He knew she'd played them. She'd told him so in that Holborn corridor, but he didn't know she'd started them in November, when she was 5 months pregnant and he hadn't returned her calls. When she'd sat in the small flat and thought about what Elena would need, and had made the decision that what Elena would need was not to meet her father as a stranger, that she would know his voice before she knew his face, that whatever happened between adults would not determine what Elena got to begin with. That was the kind of woman Vivian Hale was. The kind who played recordings in the dark so her daughter would not have to start from nothing. People talk about strength as if it's a single quality, a thing you either have or don't, a capacity that certain people are born with and others lack. What Vivian had was not one thing. It was an accumulation of choices made daily when no one was watching, of grief processed while still moving forward, of needs met that she hadn't announced and hadn't expected anyone to notice, and had met anyway because they were her needs and therefore her responsibility. It was the specific kind of strength that doesn't look dramatic because it doesn't perform itself. It just continues. It is just there. Elena would grow up knowing it, not as a lesson taught, but as a thing lived in front of her, daily, in the texture of the way her mother moved through the world. Children learn what they're immersed in. She was immersed in someone who told the truth, who kept her word, who built things carefully, and didn't abandon them when they got hard. She would be, Vivian thought, watching her daughter's head on Adrian's shoulder, a very particular kind of woman, not an easy one, not a pliant one, someone with a strong sense of what she required and the patience to wait for it and the clarity to recognize it when it arrived. Vivian knew, because she'd learned it the hard way, in a conference room with signed papers and a newborn and the weight of a year of carrying something alone, that the strongest thing a person could do was refuse to diminish themselves to fit a space they'd outgrown. That the door closing on one life was not the end of living. It was just the entrance to a hallway, and the hallway was longer than you wanted it to be, and darker, and you walked it anyway. And what waited on the other side was not what you'd lost, but something you hadn't yet had the chance to want. She had wanted it without knowing she was wanting it. And here it was. Not perfect. The elephant still had to come everywhere. Greta had opinions about everything. Her mother called on Sundays. Adrian left his coffee cups in unreasonable places. Elena was going through a phase of being deeply unreasonable about the color of her plates. But here it was. Actual. Warm. Hers. The judge's red pen was being examined by a 2.5-year-old who had decided it was the most interesting object in the room. "Elena," Vivian said. "Give it back." Elena looked at her mother with the expression of someone who considers this request worth thinking about. "Please," Adrian added. Elena considered him too. Then she handed the pen back to the judge with the gravity of someone making a significant concession. The judge accepted it with a straight face. "Thank you very much," she said. "Welcome," said Elena, which was new, a word she'd just acquired, and she said it with the confidence of someone who has no idea how much it holds, and the complete authority of someone who is going to figure it out. Vivian looked at Adrian. He looked at her. Outside, the autumn city moved and breathed and turned, indifferent and enormous, full of people building things from whatever they had, carrying what they could, leaving what they couldn't, choosing every day, mostly without knowing they were choosing, what kind of person to be. It was ordinary. It was everything. It was, in the end, the only thing that actually lasted.